എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. വാം ഗുഡ് ഈവനിങ്. പല സ്ഥലങ്ങളിലും മഴയാണ്. നമുക്കറിയാം, നമ്മൾ വലിയൊരു പ്രതിസന്ധിയിലൂടെ കടന്നുപോയിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു സമയമാണ്. It's COVID, and we are all stuck in a way at various places. And it's also kind of a mourning period because so many lives has lost to us. And I think before we begin our program, let's spare a few moments, remembering and extending our sincere condolences to those who have lost their lives during the pandemic. So thank you all for coming to this particular program. ഇന്നത്തേത് കുറച്ച് വലിയൊരു പ്രോഗ്രാമാണ്. എല്ലാവർക്കും നമ്മളുടെ ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാമിലേക്ക് വന്നതിൽ വലിയൊരു സ്വാഗതം. സത്യത്തില് കൃഷ്ണൻ മാഷിക്ക് ഒരു വലിയ സർപ്രൈസ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലും കൂടിയാണ് നമ്മൾ ഈ യാത്രയിൽ. Excuse me, somebody else's mic is on. Could you mute it for the time being? Okay, thank you. കൃഷ്ണൻ സാസ് നമ്മളെ കഴിഞ്ഞ മാർച്ച് 27 മുതൽ ഒരു ലെക്ചർ സീരീസ് കണ്ടിന്യൂ ചെയ്യുന്നതാണ്. ഇന്ന് അതിന്റെ ഒരു വാലിഡിക്ടറി ഫംഗ്ഷൻ ആണ്. ഐ ആം എ ബിറ്റ് നെർവസ് ബിക്കോസ് ദിസ് ഇസ് ദ ഫസ്റ്റ് ടൈം വി ആർ ഹാവിംഗ് two legendary teachers, excellent professors who are from the previous generation, who have been teaching generations and generations and inspiring our own teachers. So I'm sorry if I seem a little bit nervous. I don't even know how to introduce Dr. Thomas sir, and Ramendran sir and all other great teachers that have graciously accepted our invitation and come here to felicitate on our beloved Professor Dr. Krishnan sir. But we kind of organized it as a surprise to Dr. Krishnan sir. We thought if we bring his own supervisor, it would be a great pleasure to not just to him, and also it would be a great honor for us to actually, actually see and interact with Dr. Thomas. We have heard so much about him. And അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ we would love to introduce him to our gathering, even though he doesn't need any introductions. He is a legend, we all know. Sir, നമ്മളുടെ ഈ ഗ്യാതറിംഗിലേക്ക് ഒരുപാട് സ്വാഗതം, സ്നേഹം. And you are our guest of honor along with Ramachandran sir and come and talk about Krishnan sir.
Dr. Geeta is there. And Dr. Dasan has joined.
Dr. Dasan sir is there. Dr. Geeta is there. Narayanan sir promised me he would join. Ravindran sir is there. I think Sharon teacher is also there. Then we are expecting Siti sir. We are expecting Sharif sir. And there are also other scholars, teachers from School of Letters, and various teachers who once upon a time were Letterians. I think Salil Verma sir is there, Radhaishan sir is there. So it's a gathering of Krishnan sir's own teachers, his friends, his colleagues, and his students. Aju Aravind is there. I think so many of his friends are there. So എല്ലാവർക്കും ഒരു വെരി വാം വെൽക്കം. സോ അധികം നീട്ടുന്നില്ല, കാരണം തോമസ് സാറിനെ ഞാൻ ആദ്യമേ നമ്മുടെ ഗസ്റ്റ് ഓഫ് ഓണർ എന്നുള്ള നിലയിൽ സംസാരിക്കാനായിട്ട് ക്ഷണിക്കുകയാണ്. So please, the floor is all yours.
It's a great honor and a thing of great joy for me to be present at this final session when Professor Krishnan is retiring from service. The various programs being organized to honor him speak volumes for the sincere affection and genuine respect in which he is held by his colleagues and students. When the University of Calicut launched a scholarly journal by the Department of English, Krishnan was my right-hand man to achieve our objective of bringing out an error-free scholarly journal. And his meticulous attention to the details of the scholarly production and editing of an article made him such an expert that often I used to direct my doctoral students to seek his advice, especially in the mechanics of writing. Professor Krishnan has impressed me by his humility, by the simplicity of his life, his his winsome personality. He has, I'm sure, won the hearts and minds of all people, notably his colleagues and students. For me, retirement life has not been a winter of discontent, but a season of immense fulfillment and fruitfulness. And I'm sure Professor Krishnan's retired life is going to be one of great fulfillment and achievement. Achievement much greater than when he was on active teaching profession. I wish Professor Krishnan and his beautiful family long life and great happiness, filled with fulfillment and achievement. May God bless you all.
Hello, sir.
Yes?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your
Okay.
kind words. And since he has to leave soon, Krishnan, sir, would you like to respond?
Yeah, is this something that I need to respond to? I'm so happy and I feel so indebted to all my teachers, especially Professor C.T. Thomas. So whatever, I wouldn't say I have achieved, but whatever I have done, whatever I've been doing. In fact, I would probably like to respond to his words by maybe repeating what I have many times said. When I usually teach research methodology to my students, I keep telling them that when I began my research, I received many pieces of advice from my supervisor, And I particularly remember one thing: you have to develop an eye for mistakes. And this is, in fact, one advice that I have actually passed on to my students as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much once again, Professor Thomas, for coming here and felicitating about Krishnan sir and also accepting our request in a very short notice. I apologize for the delay also. So thank you very much. I think we have to move forward with our program. സത്യത്തില് ഇനി ഹോസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് നമ്മളുടെ കോലറ്ററിയൻ ആയിട്ടുള്ള സൂസൻ ആണ് from here onwards. So I'm handing my mic to her. Before that, I also would like to acknowledge that Meena ma'am is here, Hariharan sir is here, and a few more dignitaries have come to bless us, bless this. I mean, I haven't seen at that point of time. That's why I'm so sorry. But welcome all of you again to this particular program. And let's continue. Susan?
Yes, Nini Chichi. Good evening to all who have joined this meeting. My name is Susan Joseph. I studied MA English at the School of Letters during 2011 to 13 period. And I have always been in awe with the way Krishnan sir used to teach us, used to guide us in our research. He has been such a great inspiration to all of us. And I consider it my privilege to be attending this meeting. Physical presence was required. I wouldn't have been able to make it. And I'm so happy that I'm attending this meeting. And now we have to move forward to our next speaker. So I consider it my privilege to invite Dr. N. Ramachandran Nair sir, who's a retired professor at the Calicut University. And he has been Krishnan sir's professor. And he has such a large and varied circle of students whom he had inspired a lot. Let me invite Dr. N. Ramachandran Nair sir before speaking a few words. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, Professor Krishnan, Thomas sir, and all the other distinguished, yes, of course, students and associates of Krishnan and Krishnan's family. It is really a pleasure and privilege to be present for this valedictory function. You already said that 7 seminars have been already arranged. That shows the great impact that Professor Krishnan had on the students and his associates. As Thomas sir pointed out, I noted Dr. Krishnan when he was a student in early 80s, very attentive, very perceptive, and at the same time very quiet. He had done a lot of work for the journal which Thomas sir mentioned. Its name is Dyodhana. And of course, as a researcher and as a teacher, who has already proved his mettle, and I'm sure the greatest contribution that he has made will be cherished and used for further improvement by all students and his associates. I'm sure in his retired life, he will be more fruitful in carrying on his yanam, continuing his journey, academic journey, and bringing out books, articles, and helping researchers to promote their own findings. And as a teacher, I would like to point out that when Krishnan was a student and all others, in the department, we, the university teachers as a team, tried to motivate the students to seek and find rather than to listen and take down notes. On my part, I had to move from Richardson to the latest 20th century novelist, and that's a long journey, as you know. And I really assigned part of my job to my students to go to the text and assign them problems to find out ways and means to respond to them. I believe that has helped them and all the other staff members of the department at that time, Professor Thomas, Dr. Kandaswamy, and RB and others, you see, I'm sure had motivated Krishnan and others to use the library. At that time, internet was not that much. Mainly they had to depend on the library, and I believe they had used it to the fullest extent possible. I wish and pray that Krishnan will be able to continue his academic journey and do more fruitful things which will stand in future for students and associates to gain from his commitment. And he was a dedicated teacher, there is no doubt about it. Very quiet, as Thomas Sir pointed out. I fully agree with him. Very affable and always pleasing. I wish him and his family all the best in the years to come. I wish and pray for him. And thank you for the organizers for providing me this opportunity to be with you in this fine evening. Let Professor Krishnan continue his journey unabatedly and fruitfully. May God be with him and his family. All the best. Thank you for all.
Thank you for your words, Dr. N. Ramachandran Nair, sir. Now let us move to our next speaker, as the schedule for today is quite tight. Next speaker is Dr. Sherin Upporton, Honorable Director, Center for English Language and Communication Skills at MG University. Ma'am, over to you.
Hello, Sue.
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you are
Okay.
audible.
Good evening. Good evening, Professor Thomas, Dr. Ramachandran Nair, Professor Krishnan, and all my students. It's been a pleasure to be part of this felicitation of Dr. Krishnan. Especially because Krishnan has been an old friend. We have known each other since the 1980s. I'd imagined him to be like one of those evergreen heroes on celluloid, always around. But now that he has really and truly retired, it's really time for felicitations. I wish him good health and happiness, and I'm sure he will have all the time now in this new post-retirement phase of life to pursue all those interests that probably had come during active teaching career. I wish him, his family, all the very best, and I hope he will have and fruitful with this new during his career. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon ma'am, for your kind words. Now I invite Professor M. Dasan, who is a leading thinker and researcher in Dalit studies, and he has been associated with Dr. K.M. Krishnan in their common areas of interest. I welcome Professor M. Dasan for his words. Over to you, sir. Excuse me, sir. Sir, you are not audible. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to attend this valedictory on the occasion of the retirement of Professor Krishnan. Also in the presence of Professor C.T. Thomas and my dear senior colleague, N.R., Farheena and others. My association with Professor Krishnan is very short, maybe 2 decades. As a colleague of his in other universities, because I worked in Calicut, Kannur, and Central University. We had mutual academic assignments. He was supervisor and adjudicator of a couple of our theses. And I, of course, had been most often invited to MG University because I was there in the panel of adjudicators. I also had the privilege to be one of the members of the selection committee for his CAS as professor. And ever since, we have been interacting, contributing, and mutually helping in terms of teaching, research, and supervision. On this occasion, my dear friend, Professor Krishnan, I wish you all the best and a very happy, relaxed, peaceful family life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor M. Dasan, sir, for your kind words. Now I would like to invite Dr. K.M. Sethi, sir, who was former professor at the School of International Relations, MG University, who has been a contemporary of K.M. Krishnan, sir. They have been teaching in MG University around the same time. Sethi, sir.
I am so sorry to interrupt. He was not able to. I think he will be a bit late. So let's move on to the next speaker, shall we?
Yes, Vinay.
Okay.
Okay, so I am taking over the session. Next we have, I'm Nivya Thomas. I belong to the 2009-11 batch of School of Letters. In fact, next we have on the list of invited speakers, Professor M.V. Narayanan sir and K. Sharif sir and Dr. Meenati Pillai ma'am. But I think I could not find M.V. Narayanan sir and Sharif sir on the list. Could you see? Have they come?
No, unfortunately, they haven't. But that's okay. I think they will join in a later time.
Okay, so.
But
okay.
Meena ma'am is there.
Okay, so first I'll invite Dr. Meenati Pillai. I don't think she needs a special introduction because everyone, especially from School of Letters, know her. And she's a professor, Institute of English, University of Kerala. And we know that she has been constantly engaging in the cultural space. And she's also a very close friend of Krishnan sir. So I invite Meena ma'am to speak.
Thank you, Nivya. It's a great honor for me to be here today, this evening. But it is also with a great note of sadness that I sit here. It's not because I'm not sad because Professor Krishnan is retiring, because I know that he needs this rest and he needs this peace. I'm sad because I have another few years still left in the academia, and somehow the place seems a little lonely without people like him. We live in difficult times, especially the state of public universities in India currently, and the huge responsibility that is vested upon academics at this point of time to rise up to be public intellectuals, to respond to many of the things happening around us. And it is in such difficult times that I often reached out to Professor Krishnan as a senior colleague, as a dear friend, as somebody whom I really look up to. It's not very often that you meet academics like Professor Krishnan. Sometimes, often when we used to sit at a meeting together, I used to look at him and wonder about that quiet inner strength. There's so much I learned from him. The way you can combine empathy with rigor, with a great critical rigor. He was very strict in many of the doctoral committees and boards of studies that we attended together. I could see that there was a great rigor about the way in which he took things very seriously. It was not in any lax manner that he would look at things, but at the same time, the infinite empathy with which he approached the issue, especially when it came to students and student issues. So I've always wondered. Sometimes, that quote from Rumi used to come to me: the quieter you become, the more you are able to hear. And I've often thought about, that if that quote had a face, if it had a person attached to it, that would be Professor Krishnan for me. Because there was so much of silence in him. At the same time, it was a silent strength that colleagues like me borrowed from him. When we used to go for many of the CAS promotions, etc., the moment I heard that Professor Krishnan was there, he would be with me, there was a great consolation that I drew, because I knew that if he was there, things would be proper and things would not be in any sense any less rigorous than the demands of the meeting. So that's the kind of person Professor Krishnan was. And I think it's a sad loss to the academia in Kerala. As Arundhati Roy would say, it's not a retirable age as far as Professor Krishnan is concerned, because I'm being very selfish here, but many of us had got very used to him. And cutting across Kerala, cutting across the public universities in Kerala, there was a network of comfort, there was a network of affinity, there was a network of camaraderie that we had built, and Professor Krishnan was one of the. I think I would like to call him one of the nucleus, of that kind of a network. So for me personally, and for many of my other academic friends in the universities in Kerala, it's a huge loss. But then I think Professor Krishnan has invested wisely, and there is a robust generation of students. As I look at him today, sitting again quietly on my window screen, I can see that there is his past that he's looking at. There is also his future that he's looking at. So many of his students, or in whom he has invested so robustly, that now is the time to sit back and enjoy the fruits and the peace and the happiness of that investment. I'm not saying adieu, Krishnan Mashe. I'll see you again. I think we'll keep on seeing each other. But it was a great joy. It was a great pleasure, and it was also an even more great comfort to work with you. Few people have given me this kind of peace and this kind of support. Thank you so much for everything. Wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. And we also hope that we would meet Krishnan sir again and again. And let's move on to the next speaker. As we know, we are on a tight schedule. That's why, even though we wanted to accommodate all our students and give opportunity to all of them to speak, we may not able to be not able to do that. But since it's a gathering of Krishnan sir's friends, colleagues, and students, along with his teachers, I think we should move on to one of his colleagues. He Geeta ma'am, I know you are here. Even though I haven't asked you permission before, I hope that you would say a few words about Krishnan sir. Hello? Geeta ma'am, can you hear me?
Excuse me, Vinit Chichi. I think she has left the meeting a while.
Oh, okay, okay. Not to worry. We hope that she will come back. Actually, there is storms and heavy rainfall at different parts of Kerala. So that's one of the reasons why so many people were not able to attend. So in that case, let's move on to our dear Ravindran Mash. So he is here. I've just seen him. Hello. Hello, Ravindran Mash.
Hello.
Ha. Sir, please say a few words.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Yeah.
When Vinny spoke to me in the morning, I had suggested that we the insiders of the School of Letters can always speak, but it's for the others to be speaking on an occasion like this. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here, especially because this is a very different kind of meeting organized by the students of a teacher, in which you have the teachers on teachers attending. This is a great occasion. You have a lineage of teachers and students attending a meeting, and that is great. I'm happy to be part of this. Certainly, Krishnan has been a friend of mine for a very long time. We have been friends for the past, I think, more than 40 years. And we have a lot of, certainly personally, I have a lot of things to say about Krishnan, but I don't want to do that here. I would merely repeat what others have said about Krishnan, about his, personal qualities. I would only, attest to that. And I will wish him all the very best for a very happy and prosperous retirement life, which I'm sure he must have found out by now that it's not a very bad idea at all, to be retired from active service, from official service, and to do things at one's own pleasure. Anyway, thank you very much for organizing this very splendid kind of meeting for Krishnan. And let me once again wish Krishnan all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm following your advice, and I'll definitely call somebody who is not from Letters now. Our dear Professor Hariharan sir is here. I've just seen him, so I hope that he would be able to say a few words. He has been a continuous presence in our lecture series. He's a dear friend of Krishnan sir. So I invite Hariharan sir to felicitate.
A very good, a very good evening to everyone here. ഞാൻ കുറച്ച് മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിക്കാം, ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പറയുന്നില്ല. എനിക്ക് ഏറ്റവും വലിയ സന്തോഷം തോന്നിയത് സി ടി തോമസ് സാറിനെ ഇതിൽ കണ്ടു എന്നുള്ളതായിരുന്നു. സി ടി തോമസ് സാറിനെ കണ്ടു, പിന്നെ എൻ ആറിനെ കണ്ടു, പിന്നെ പി പി ആറിനെ കണ്ടു, കൃഷ്ണ മാഷെ കണ്ടു, ഷെറിൻ ടീച്ചറിനെ കണ്ടു, ഗീത ടീച്ചറെ കണ്ടു. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിൽ കൃഷ്ണ സാറിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ സ്റ്റുഡൻസിനെയും ഒരുവിധം കുറേ ആളുകൾ ഇവിടെ കണ്ടു. അപ്പം പി പി ആർ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ തന്നെ എത്രയോ ജനറേഷൻസ് ആണ് ഓഫ് ടീച്ചേഴ്സ് ആൻഡ് സ്റ്റുഡൻസ്. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു വേദി ആയി മാറി എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത്. കൃഷ്ണൻ സാറിന് വളരെ വളരെ ഒരു റിച്ച് ആയിട്ടുള്ളൊരു മൊമെന്റ് ആണിത് എന്നുള്ളത് എനിക്ക് സംശയമില്ല. എനിക്ക് അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണ് സാറിനും തോന്നിയിട്ടുണ്ടാവും ഒരു പക്ഷേ. അതിൽ എനിക്കും പങ്ക് ചേരാൻ സാധിച്ചതിൽ എനിക്കും വലിയ സന്തോഷമുണ്ട്. സാറിനെ കുറിച്ച് പറയാന്നുള്ളതല്ല, എനിക്ക് കോട്ടയം CMS കോളേജിൻ്റെ ശോഭന ടീച്ചർ റിസർച്ച് ചെയ്യുന്ന സമയത്താണ് കൃഷ്ണമാഷെ കുറിച്ച് ഞാൻ കുറച്ചുകൂടി അധികം അറിയുന്നത്, 90കളിൽ ആദ്യത്തെ തുടക്കത്തിൽ. അപ്പം സാറിനോട് റിസർച്ച് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്നു ശോഭന ടീച്ചർ. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഒത്തിരി തവണ ലെക്ചേഴ്സിൽ ഞാൻ വന്ന സമയത്തൊക്കെ സാറിനെ കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ളതാണ്, അടുത്ത് ഇടപെടാൻ സാധിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നതാണ്. ഇപ്പോഴും അതെ, വളരെ സോഫ്റ്റ് സ്പോക്കൺ, എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയുന്ന കാര്യമാണ്. സാറ് എങ്ങനെയാണ് എല്ലാവരോടും സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്, പെരുമാറുന്നത് എങ്ങനെയാണെന്നുള്ളതൊക്കെ അറിയാം. ഞാൻ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് എടുത്ത് പറയുന്നില്ല. പക്ഷേ ഒരു മനസ്സിൽ ഈ ഇടം പിടിക്കുന്ന ആളുകളുണ്ടല്ലോ, അതിൽ സാർ എപ്പോഴും ഉള്ളതാണ്. മനസ്സിലെപ്പോഴും കൊണ്ട് നടക്കുന്ന ഒരു വ്യക്തിത്വം എന്ന് പറയാം. അങ്ങനത്തെ ഒരു സൗഹൃദം എനിക്ക് കിട്ടിയാൽ എൻ്റെ വലിയൊരു ഭാഗ്യം. പിന്നെ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ നേരത്തെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു, ഇത്രയും ആളുകൾ സംസാരിക്കുന്നതിൻ്റെ ഇടയ്ക്ക് എനിക്ക് ഇങ്ങനത്തെ ഒരു അവസരം തന്നു. അതിലും വലിയ സന്തോഷമുണ്ട്. പിന്നെ റിസർച്ച് സ്കോളേഴ്സ്, ലെറ്റേഴ്സിലെ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ്, ഫോമർ സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് എല്ലാവരും ചേർന്ന് ഇങ്ങനൊരു പ്രോഗ്രാം ഒരു പീരീഡ്, ഒരു മാസത്തിൻ്റെ ഇടയിൽ തന്നെ ഈ ഒരു കോവിഡ് കാലത്ത് ഇങ്ങനെ ചെയ്യാന്ന് പറയുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും അത് തന്നെ സാറിനോടുള്ള ബഹുമാനം, ഇഷ്ടം ഒക്കെ അത് പ്രതിഫലിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഭാഗം ആയതിലും എനിക്കും വലിയ സന്തോഷമുണ്ട്. സാറിന് എല്ലാവിധ മംഗളങ്ങളും, എല്ലാ നല്ലതും സാറിനും സാറിൻ്റെ ഫാമിലിക്കും ഞാൻ എന്താ പറയുക, ഈശ്വരനോട് പ്രാർത്ഥിക്കുകയാണ്. താങ്ക് യു വെരി മച്ച്.
താങ്ക് യു സർ, താങ്ക് യു സോ മച്ച്. നമ്മൾ ഇതുവരെ കൃഷ്ണൻ സാറിന്റെ അധ്യാപകരിൽ നിന്നും അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ സഹപ്രവർത്തകരിൽ നിന്നും സുഹൃത്തുക്കളിൽ നിന്നും ഒക്കെ കേട്ടു. ഇനി നമുക്ക് ഒരു സ്റ്റുഡന്റിനെ കൂടി വിളിക്കാം എന്ന് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു. അജു അരവിന്ദ് IIT ഝാർഖണ്ഡിൽ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നു അധ്യാപകനായിട്ട്. കൃഷ്ണൻ സാറിന്റെ PhD സ്കോളർ ആയിരുന്നു. ആൻഡ് I would like to invite Aju Aravind to share his experience.
First of all, this is in fact a great honor for me to be part of this program. I met Krishnan sir for the first time when I joined master's program in School of Letters. So I still remember the time when he was such a kind of a person who would always be silent but yet try to bring the best out of us. So I especially remember the first time when I did a term paper. It was under sir. It was really a fortunate thing that he made me write it 12 times, saying that it was mechanical. So that in fact changed a lot. Apart from all the things, I was also fortunate to do my PhD program under sir's guidance. But what I felt more was the person, the faculty, more than a teacher, which he was a guru, a friend, who took things outside, and sometimes he would stand on his, go out of the box for us, stand with us, talk for us, and especially the political positions which he took. He was not merely a person who just said things for the sake of saying it, but he was such a kind of person who took an active stand on what he said, and which in fact made most of us proud. But okay, fine, he's a different sort of a person. But more, the silence which he had. But behind the silence, there was a big volcano of knowledge, a big volcano of friendship, a big volcano of love and all those things. Even a few days before, when I had some personal thing, we could easily call him up. We never required a kind of introduction. And especially when I go down to Kerala, or even when I was doing my academic program there, every now and then there's no particular restriction around the time in which we could go to his house. It would be 8 or 9:30, but whatever, the perfect tea which we got there and the time which sir used to spend was something great. And I would of course like to say that sir, you are really unmatched and really very blessed to have known you and to be a part of your life. Thanks a lot, sir. All the best.
Thank you, Aju. And let's move on to next speakers. There are a lot of professors that we have here. I've also seen T.K. Narayanan sir. If he's the same person, I think he is. Hello, sir.
He is Leah's brother.
Okay. Sir is there, and
you can even ask him to speak.
Yeah, that's it. Hello, sir. Narayanan sir.
He shares the name with Kerala Kalamdam's Vice Chancellor.
Hello, sir. I think. Am I audible?
I think Dr. Geeta has returned.
Dr. Geeta has returned. Yeah. I think Narayanan sir is not able to, because maybe some range issues, but Geeta teacher has returned. Hello, ma'am. Geeta ma'am. Can you hear me? Hello, Geeta ma'am. Hello.
She has left.
She has left. I think there are range issues because of the.
She's back.
No. She's here.
Maybe
Hello,
you can
Geeta
ask her to speak. She has switched on the camera.
Ma'am, would you like to say a few words? I haven't taken your permission before. I'm so sorry for that. But would you like to say a few words? I think her voice is muted.
Yes. Excuse me, Geeta ma'am. Ma'am, you are in mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Geeta ma'am, your voice is mute. Yeah, I think you better type it there in the message box. I think we will send her a message for the time being. I would like to invite Shobhana ma'am. I have seen her here. Ma'am, are you there? She was a PhD student, a very, I think one of the earliest, she belonged to one of the earliest batch of PhDs, and she was here. Hello?
Hello?
Hello. Oh, okay, ma'am. Okay. Sorry. Okay, ma'am. Okay. Please continue.
I'm Geeta, and I think I joined the Calicut University department for the first time. I mean, that was my first appointment. And luckily or unluckily, Krishnan missed to be my student because I went on changing places now and again. So he was in when I was out of the department. But still, I always felt that I belonged to that department. I couldn't part myself from the department. So I was really happy to have Dr. Thomas, NRN, and everybody today. Yeah, and when I came over to School of Letters, I think Krishnan was the only familial link. Even though there were so many people who moved from Calicut to School of Letters, Krishnan was the only familiar and friendly link that I had from the old background. I really cherished that association. And I wish him all the best. And I would like to tell him that I really enjoyed all his help and association, which we started from Calicut, even though I haven't taught him in Calicut, but still there was maybe we had that link through Dr. Thomas, and I really cherish those days and all the association I had with him, and I wish him all the best. I still remember how he came and told me about his marriage, how he came and told me about his son, etc., etc. So that was more than an academic association. I think I had some kind of personal touch with Krishnan, and I really cherish it. And I hope it will continue, and I wish him all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I think we are about to, reach a time limit. But even though we have Hari sir, we have Saji sir, we have so many of Krishnan sir's students here. George is here, Adira is here. So many students and teachers are there. So two more people can speak, and feel free to unmute your mic and speak. There are two more opportunities left for us before we ask Krishnan sir for his response.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else would like to speak? Say something to Krishnan sir. The Saji sir, Radhakrishnan sir, and Hari sir is also there. There are a lot of students who belong to Krishnan sir. So feel free to speak. If not, we would like to ask Krishnan sir for his responses. We are so sorry that we cannot accommodate all our students, colleagues, and well-wishers and the teachers because of the time limit. We all know that 3 hours is the maximum we can ask all of you to sit and watch a program online. That's the ഇഷ്യൂ വിത്ത് അതാണ് നമ്മളുടെ പരാധീനത. അതുകൊണ്ട് എല്ലാവരും ക്ഷമിക്കണം, സംസാരിക്കാൻ അവസരം കിട്ടാത്ത എല്ലാവരും ക്ഷമിക്കണം. ആൻഡ് ഇഫ് ഇനി ആരെങ്കിലും സംസാരിക്കാനുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും മൈക്ക് ഓണാക്കി സംസാരിക്കുക. അതർവൈസ് വി വിൽ മൂവ് ഓൺ ടു the next part of the gathering, which is Krishnan sir's response to all these kind words that we have heard from his colleagues and friends and students. So if nobody is willing to speak, I invite Krishnan sir for his response. And I also hope that maybe after the lecture session, those who are not able to participate in this particular session would be able to respond to the lecture that you are about to hear. So Krishnan sir, please, I invite you to.
Thank you, Vinny. ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ വേണോ മലയാളത്തിൽ വേണോ പറയേണ്ടത്?
പക്ഷെ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞോളൂ, അറിയാതെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലായി
Because at School of Letters, inside the classroom, I don't use a single word of Malayalam. But outside, we very liberally use Malayalam. അതാണ് ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഒരു പ്രാക്ടീസ്. പിന്നെ ഹരിയും നേരത്തെ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞത് കൊണ്ട് I think there is only my good friend Farheena who unfortunately doesn't happen to follow Malayalam. All the others can, I suppose, follow Malayalam. പക്ഷെ അത് പറഞ്ഞ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലായിപ്പോയി. I am so happy and thankful to all my former students for organizing this wonderful series of lectures. I could not have actually asked for more. ഒരു സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിൽ മാത്രമല്ല, എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു നമ്മുടെ മഹാത്മാഗാന്ധി യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു അധ്യാപകന് കിട്ടിയതിൽ വെച്ച് ഏറ്റവും വലിയ ഒരു ഫെയർവെൽ പാർട്ടിയായി തവണത്തേത്. അപ്പാർട്ട് ഫ്രം ദ സീരീസ് ഓഫ് ലെക്ചേഴ്സ് ഓർഗനൈസ്ഡ് ബൈ ദ ഫാക്കൽറ്റി, പിന്നെ 3 ദിവസത്തെ വലിയ ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രാം, ഒപ്പം തന്നെ അലുംനായി നടത്തുന്ന ഈ ലെക്ചർ സീരീസ്, അങ്ങനെ പല രീതിയിൽ ഞാൻ ഇത്രയൊക്കെ അർഹിക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ എന്ന് സ്വയം സംശയിപ്പിക്കുന്ന രീതിയിലുള്ള വലിയ ഒരു ഫെയർവെല്ലാണ് എനിക്ക് കിട്ടിയത്. ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഞാൻ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിൽ ജോയിൻ ചെയ്യുന്ന സമയത്ത് പ്രായം കൊണ്ട് ഏറ്റവും കുറഞ്ഞ, ഏറ്റവും ജൂനിയർ ഞാനായിരുന്നു. പക്ഷെ റിട്ടയർ ചെയ്യുന്ന സമയമാകുമ്പോഴേക്കും സ്വാഭാവികമായിട്ടും ഐ ടേൺഡ് ഔട്ട് ടു ബി ദ ഓൾഡസ്റ്റ് ആസ് വെൽ. പക്ഷേ അനന്തമൂർത്തി സാർ കൊണ്ടുവന്ന ഒരു ജനറേഷൻ എന്ന രീതിയിലാണ് ഞങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഗീത ടീച്ചറെ ഞാനും ഒക്കെ അറിയപ്പെടുന്നത്. PPR ഒക്കെ. അതിൽ അവസാനത്തെ കണ്ണി എന്നുള്ള നിലയ്ക്ക് മറ്റു രീതിയിൽ പറയുമ്പോൾ ഇന്ന് തിരിഞ്ഞു നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഒരു വലിയ തലമുറയിലെ അവസാനത്തെ കണ്ണി എന്ന രീതിയിൽ ഇപ്പൊ പല ഈ സെൻഡ് ഓഫ് മീറ്റിംഗ്സ് ഉണ്ടായി. അതിലൊക്കെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞൊരു കാര്യം that we are retiring from service should also mean that this is actually the time for a major paradigm shift. ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഞങ്ങൾ കഴിഞ്ഞ ഒരു 30 വർഷമായിട്ട് സംസാരിച്ചതോ ചിന്തിച്ചതോ ആയ കാര്യങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് വളരെ വ്യത്യസ്തമായിട്ട് പുതിയ രീതിയിൽ ചിന്തിക്കുന്ന പുതിയ തലമുറയിൽപ്പെട്ട അധ്യാപകരുടെയും ഗവേഷകരുടെയും വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളുടെയും ഒരു തലമുറ, ഒരു പുതിയ വിചാര മാതൃക. ദിസ് ഇസ് ആക്ച്വലി ദ ടൈം ഫോർ എ മേജർ പാരഡൈം ഷിഫ്റ്റ് എന്ന രീതിയിലാണ് ഞാനിതിനെ കണ്ടത്. പക്ഷെ അതിന് ഒരു കാരണമായിട്ട് ഈ ഇത്രയും വലിയ ഒരു ഫെയർവെൽ പാർട്ടി നടക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത് എനിക്ക് അങ്ങേയറ്റം സന്തോഷമുള്ള ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഈ ഒരു അവസരത്തിൽ പറയേണ്ടുന്നത് ഈ അലുംനായി. ഞാന് ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞാലേ ശരിയാവുകയുള്ളൂ. നമ്മൾ പൊതുവെ പഴയ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളെ പൂർവ്വ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾ എന്നാണ് പറയാറുള്ളത്. പക്ഷെ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിൽ ഞാൻ എനിക്ക് വാക്കുകൊണ്ട് കളിക്കുന്ന ഒരു രീതിയുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ട് അവ യൂഷ്വലി കോൾ ദം അപൂർവ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾ എന്നാണ് പറയാറുള്ളത്. ഞാൻ ആരുടെയും പേരെടുത്ത് പറയുന്നില്ല, പക്ഷേ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിൽ മിക്കവാറും പഠിച്ച എല്ലാവരും തന്നെ അപൂർവ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളാണ്. അതിൽ കുറെ പേരെ നമുക്കിപ്പോൾ ഈ മീറ്റിംഗിൽ കാണുകയും ചെയ്യാം. പേരൊന്നും ഞാൻ എടുത്ത് പറയുന്നില്ല. ഒരു സൗകര്യവും ഇല്ലാത്ത ഒരു ഗ്രാമത്തിലാണ് ഞാൻ ജനിച്ചു വളർന്നത്. അന്ന് ഇലക്ട്രിസിറ്റി ഇല്ല, ബസ് സർവീസ് ഇല്ല, അങ്ങനെ ഒന്നുമില്ലാത്ത ഒരു ഗ്രാമത്തിൽ നിന്ന് ജനിച്ചു വളർന്ന് ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പഠിച്ച് ഒരു യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ പ്രൊഫസറായിട്ട് റിട്ടയർ ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിയുക എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു പക്ഷേ അന്നത്തെ നിലയ്ക്ക് നമ്മുടെ സ്വപ്നങ്ങൾക്ക് അപ്പുറത്തുള്ള ഒരു കാര്യമായിരുന്നു. പക്ഷെ അത് സാധ്യമാക്കിയത് എൻ്റെ അധ്യാപകരാണ്. ഒരു പക്ഷേ ചെറിയ ക്ലാസ്സുകളിൽ നിന്ന് എന്നെ പഠിപ്പിച്ച അധ്യാപകർ മുതൽ എനിക്ക് ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് ഉപയോഗിക്കാം എന്ന് ഒരു കോൺഫിഡൻസ് തന്ന ഒരു ടീച്ചറുണ്ട് സ്കൂളിൽ. സുമതി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ടീച്ചറാണ്. ടീച്ചർ നമ്മുടെ ഈ ശ്രീധരന്റെ കുടുംബത്തിൽപ്പെട്ട ഒരാളാണ്, ഞങ്ങളൊരു നാട്ടുകാരൻ. ആ ടീച്ചർ അതുപോലെ എന്നെ പഠിപ്പിച്ച എത്ര അധ്യാപകർ. ഒരുപക്ഷെ 1ാം ക്ലാസ്സിൽ പഠിപ്പിച്ച അധ്യാപിക ദേവകി ടീച്ചർ മുതൽ എൻ്റെ PhD സൂപ്പർവൈസർ ആയിരുന്ന CT തോമസ് സാർ വരെയുള്ള എത്രയോ അധ്യാപകർ. അവരില്ലായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഞാനില്ല. അത്രയേ ഉള്ളൂ. ഒരുപാട് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ ഈ പല പല വേദികളിലായിട്ട് ഫെയർവെൽ മീറ്റിങ്ങുകൾ ഉണ്ടായി. അപ്പോഴൊക്കെ എനിക്ക് സംസാരിക്കാൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നില്ല. പക്ഷേ ഈ അവസാനം വരുന്ന സമയത്ത് തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും, കാരണം ഒരു പക്ഷേ എൻ്റെ അധ്യാപകരും എൻ്റെ സഹപ്രവർത്തകരും എൻ്റെ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളും എന്നെ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്ന സുഹൃത്തുക്കളും ഒക്കെ അടങ്ങുന്ന ഈ വേദിയിൽ ഒരു പരിധി കുറച്ചൊക്കെ വികാരത്തിന് അടിപ്പെട്ടു പോകുന്നു. ഞാൻ ഒരു കാലത്ത് ഒരു ദൈവവിശ്വാസിയായിരുന്നില്ല, ഇപ്പോഴുമല്ല, ഇനി ആവുമെന്ന് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നില്ല. മനുഷ്യനെ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നയാളാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞൊരു കാര്യം ഇതാണ്: എല്ലാ ദിവസവും ഞാൻ എപ്പോഴും ഓർക്കുന്നത് എൻ്റെ അധ്യാപകരെയാണ്. ആ അധ്യാപകർ എനിക്ക് നൽകിയ ചെറിയ അറിവുകൾ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവരിൽ നിന്ന് എനിക്ക് കിട്ടിയ ചെറിയ അറിവുകൾ മാത്രമാണ് ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്ക് പറഞ്ഞു കൊടുത്തിട്ടുള്ളത്. അത് എനിക്ക് ആത്മാർത്ഥമായിട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞുവെന്ന് കുറെ പേർക്കെങ്കിലും തോന്നുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അതിലും വലിയൊരു ചാരിതാർത്ഥ്യം എനിക്ക് ഇല്ല. ഈ ഒരു ചടങ്ങ് സംഘടിപ്പിച്ച, ഈ ഒരു ചടങ്ങല്ല, ഈ ഒരു ലെക്ചർ സീരീസും ഈ അവസാനത്തെ ഈ ചടങ്ങ് സംഘടിപ്പിച്ച എൻ്റെ എല്ലാ നല്ല വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്കും, ഇതിൽ പങ്കെടുത്ത എൻ്റെ എല്ലാ അധ്യാപകർക്കും സഹപ്രവർത്തകർക്കും വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്കും സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്കും ഒക്കെ നന്ദി പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ നിർത്തുന്നു. എല്ലാവർക്കും എൻ്റെ ഭാവങ്ങൾ. വിനി.
Thank you so much, sir, for being there for all of us.
I will always be there.
It's such an honor for us. You were always been our constant presence in School of Letters. People may come, people may go, but Krishnan sir would be there at 10 o'clock every day. And that helped us a lot. That helped us, I don't know, I don't want to say more and make it an emotional space more than it is right now. but still, we love you, sir, and we cherish the classes that we received. More than classes, we cherish every moment of your time that you have given us by correcting our papers. And I am more than anyone else in depth for that very act of correcting papers. Uh, Both Krishnan sir and every other teachers, as well as my friends, know that I'm very bad at writing. So I know that many other students will also agree with me in pointing out the fact that Krishnan sir will always be there correcting our papers. Each and every minute details would be corrected, no matter what, no compromise in the quality of our paper. That's what we have learned from Krishnan sir, and that's what we are trying to uh, do with our students also. And it's an inspiration for all of us. Thank you so much, sir. Actually, we were planning it to be, we were planning to wind this particular session by talking about our entire lecture series, but I think we have exceeded our time period along with their expectations, I suppose. So without much ado, I think we have to start our next session, and I really, really request you to please stay with us for the lecture. It's a wonderful lecture. And in order to chair this session, host this session, I invite Dr. Nivea Thomas, who is also a librarian like us. She will be introducing Dr. Farheena Danta ma'am. So I'm handing over the metaphorical mic to Nivea.
Thank you, Winnie. So once again, good evening, everyone. As you know, we have organized this lecture series to honor our beloved Professor Dr. K.M. Krishnan on his retirement. And this is the last lecture of our lecture series and the third one in English. So I'm very glad to introduce the speaker of our session, who is Dr. Farheena Danta. She is a professor of Department of English, Tezpur University, Assam. And moreover, she is a very close friend of our Krishnan sir. And her area of interest include American literature, cultural studies, and modernist poetics. And the topic of today's session is Asian American Migration Narratives, History, Practice, and Politics. So I'm very glad to welcome you, ma'am. I also welcome our beloved Professor Dr. K.M. Krishnan to this session. And I also welcome all our teachers, research scholars, and participants to this session. Now I invite Dr. Farheena Danta ma'am to deliver the lecture. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Nivea. Good evening once again, and I'd also like to thank everybody for giving me this chance. Yes, Krishnan and I go back a long way. We used to do our research together at the ASRC in the late 80s. So yes, we have been in the loop, more or less. Recently, Krishnan sent me a link for one of his students, Viva, and it was on migration again, writing. So I thought maybe, since this is something my scholars and I also work on from time to time, so I'll also make an attempt to communicate a few of my random thoughts, maybe, although a lot would be common ground, so please excuse me if I go over boring territory. I just want to talk about the early migrants to America, that is the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans. People who went to America through Hawaii. Hawaii was not initially a territory of the US. It was an independent territory. Now, some of you might also wonder, why not the Philippines? The Filipinos gained direct access to the USA at around the same time at the turn of the century, but then it was already a US colony. Control of Philippines had been handed over to the US government by the Spanish government. So till 1946, probably, if I have my right, Philippines was under US dominion or US rule, and they had easier access to the US, unlike some of their neighbors from Korea or Japan or China. These people had to work through a lot of severe US legislation denying them certain rights, certain facilities, revoking their positions. And so I feel that if we talk about Asian American migration narratives, these are mainly Southeast Asian maybe, we should take a look at the way they came to America, the struggles they faced, the ideas and the technology they brought in those days, especially the Chinese, and how they contributed to the making of America. It is said that the making of America depends on the unmaking of other places. This was said long ago in the context of Europe, that the settlement of America depends on the unsettlement of Europe. Europeans kept coming to America and grabbing territory, landing on the East Coast and then moving horizontally westwards. But these Asians came to Hawaii and from Hawaii to the West Coast. So their early settlements were along the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. So I'd like to talk a little about their early journey. And then so I'll tell the Japanese story, the Chinese story, and the Korean story. There are similarities, but there are also differences of religion, of maybe their reception under US law, and then the kind of writing they produce. There are similarities, but there are also slight differences. And I had also said earlier that these writers were expected to write a particular kind of narrative about trauma at home, what made them come to America, how America is great. So whatever they wrote, the autobiographical imperative was forced on them. It was made to appear like they had written it from their own experience, although it might have been totally imagined or fictional. But somehow along the line, these writers also felt that they could also offer a critique of life in America, the conditions, the reception amongst other communities, their struggle within their own communities. So these make for interesting reading. There are a lot of nuances in their writing. So I'll just begin by reading some of it. So first I'll talk about the history part, then a couple of examples from a few novels, highlighting a couple of issues. And that'll, I think, help me to sum up. But first, the story of the migration, before that, narratives, and then also a little bit of history about some of the writers, just brief mention. So this might be common ground for a lot of you. So it is seen that differences in the nature and pattern of migration and settlement in America lend contours and depth to the words and to the works of writers, intertwining issues pertaining to settlement or relocation, personal, cultural, and political identities, pulls of contrary cultures, issues of race, social acceptability in the United States, which is often revocable or contingent, renewal of interest in the erstwhile homeland, along with personal and larger American histories. While each of these narratives, fictional or autobiographical, have a story or stories to tell, they also foreground or at times embed the tensions of American domestic and foreign policy towards migrants coming to or residing in the United States of America. This was all contingent on the US attitude towards your country of origin. So if the Chinese were banished at one time, later on they became acceptable when the Japanese were incarcerated in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. I'll come to that later. So apart from the obvious factors of displacement, culture shock, and sense of alienation, followed by attempts at assimilation within a community, as well as the larger American society, I'd like to talk about the complication of settlement, reception, and the market, as well as work opportunities and conditions available to the migrants from American countries. While European migrants were allowed to land on the main coast of America, Asians were directed to Angel Island for thorough screening and profiling. Angel Island is a small location in San Francisco Bay. So they were kept there, and it's almost like the present migrant ghettos in very cramped and unhygienic conditions. They were forced to stay there for sometimes even months if their claims were doubtful. Treated with suspicion by various sections of the American public, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and other Asian migrants found themselves branded with a group identity based on race and color, followed by religious denominations. Some of these people happen to be Christians, the Filipinos, and also the Koreans. So they had a greater degree of acceptability compared to the Chinese and the Japanese. The reasons for the migration of Asians to America are numerous. Many fled threats to their lives from war and revolution. Others had been displaced by economic and social upheaval. And still others have been recruited to meet the demands of new labor markets or seek opportunities to invest their human or financial capital. While a majority of immigrants came in search of better job opportunities, some were forced to look for options outside their homelands to survive political conflict as well as economic crisis. So their migration motives or reasons were different from those of, for example, India or some of the neighboring countries. There was never any kind of political crisis that they had to escape from. Whereas these people were constantly under flight, and this flight motive dominated their narratives later, or they should, as some of the critics point out. In fact, America welcomed different kinds of people with varying work potential to meet different kinds of market and social needs at different times. However, the later decades of the 20th century produced another wave of migrants from Asia with considerably less education, less money, and less cosmopolitan backgrounds than the 70s and the 80s. Those are the recent people who formed a workforce, maybe taxi drivers and other people even willing to do other menial jobs. And interestingly, women also form a considerable number amongst these working class immigrants as servers, cleaners, domestic workers, low-wage assembly workers, data processors, and so on. If at one time there were openings for skilled and trained middle-class personnel, they were followed by the need for cheap labor in the domestic and other sectors. Refugees and other desperate people seeking shelter in the United States were willing to accept any kind of lowly job if it guaranteed them a regular income. A lot of these people who were qualified as doctors and engineers ended up running maybe repair shops or doing other inferior jobs. Immigrants to America found their way to various corners of the USA and took up whatever business or work opportunities that were available to them. With so many ethnicities making their presence felt in America, it became difficult to decide what or who is American. So I'd just like to use a quote from Inderpal Grewal to highlight this point. She says, Americanness is a concept. In her book, Transnational America, she says, Americanness is a concept shifted by location and place and historical context, as well as factors such as race, gender, class, nationality, and religion, producing different kinds of subjects. This shifting and changing national subject would be, as with immigrants, transnational, moving across nations and national boundaries to produce American identities imbricated within a consumer citizenship that exceeded the bounds of the nation to become transnational. If these people were not accepted as citizens, they were given some kind of status as national subjects or permits as residents. It shows that whatever necessary, where necessary, for commercial reasons, the migrant population was accepted as American with similar demands for consumer products. The operative phrase here is affiliative practices of belonging, indicating a kind of acceptance as part of the American social fabric under an aggressive consumer culture. Moreover, these affiliative practices enable the formation of subjects of displacement and of national belonging by enabling them to become provisionally attached to new identities. Now, policy changes in the 60s allowed for the migration of educated and trained Asians, including Indians, Pakistanis, people from West Asia, as well as South and Southeast Asia, to America. That was when they opened up somewhat, followed by the legislation of 1965, when it was made even better. So this widened the multi-ethnic settler space in America. It entailed for the migrant a search for a new livelihood, overcoming displacement and sense of alienation, negotiating social discrimination, racism, complications of labor in the common workplace, as well as in the specialized job sector. The 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act not only did away with the limited numbers of immigrants per country, it also facilitated the migration of family members as well as skilled professionals who chose to migrate for better prospects in life. So given the diversity of the immigrants from Asia in America, their narratives form an extraordinarily rich, complex, and contradictory tapestry of human experience. As the conflicting accounts suggest, there are different realities among widely diverse Asian populations. Consequently, migration literature has evolved to portray the changing immigrant condition as well as the new challenges that have come to define them. It is in facing the challenges of living in a foreign land that the immigrant identity is shaped as a people and as individuals. Like all other immigrants, they start off with dislocation, culture shock, a sense of displacement. So those problems were very much there, plus the language barrier for those who had not made the effort to learn, especially the early laborers. So one of the earliest pieces of writing was around 1934 by a Filipino writer called Carlos Bulasan, who wrote "America is in the heart." Although he was disenchanted by the racism that he faced there, but he still said that he was committed to America. He had learned English and then made the effort to write down his memoir. Or it's also semi-fictional. So migrant writing addresses issues of displacement from the erstwhile homeland accompanied by a rhetoric of loss. To the migrant population in America, the search for a place and a community is as important as livelihood options and opportunities. However, complications within ethnic ghettos or enclaves are not uncommon as crime and corruption undermine the community spirit. It makes sense, therefore, to examine why accounts of Asian immigrant experience include not only communal adaptations to life in America, The adaptations resonate well in the face of racial discrimination, but also problems related to identity, gender, and sexuality, as well as the challenge of different cultures at home and the greater white American culture outside. So at home, they were used to something, and then the greater world of white American culture outside. Something inside the community, the Chinatown or the ethnic enclave where they maybe lived, and something else elsewhere. In many early Asian American novels, writers set trauma in a distant mother country or within an insular Asian family to ensure that their pain is not a reproof against American politics or domestic racism, the main forces that cause their pain. Some of these accounts were about flight from a troubled country to America, while others were about their hopes for a better life and improve work opportunities. Initially, they were rather diffident about telling the truth or losing face. They felt that shame was part of their lot, and disapproval that they faced in white society was something they had to live with, not talk about it. So while the first generation of Asian immigrants had to live through racial, political, economic, and social discriminations in America, their children and descendants born in America see themselves as Americans and subscribe to American values. This results in both cultural and generational conflicts within migrant families. If the parents talk nostalgically of their erstwhile homelands, their children can only respond to it in terms of the exoticized other. They only hear those stories. The duality of cultural affiliations leads to a hyphenated identity, in fact, a hyphenated consciousness amongst the second and succeeding generations of Asian Americans. This is seen initially in the clash of cultures that the migrants have to live through within and outside their homes, and gradually through a more confident assertion of ethnic differences within the larger American nationality. Initially, they were not accepted as fully American, and later on, they were proud to assert their parents' cultural identity or what they had inherited without actually claiming a direct link to the erstwhile homeland. So I mean, they have to negotiate between their own cultural ties and those parameters decided for them by American society. This creates the space for what Kathy Park Hong calls minor feelings. Some of you must have heard of her book she wrote last year, where she talks about minor feelings which Asian Americans should talk about and which are not recognized by the mainstream. So, which occurs, she explains, I quote, when American optimism is enforced upon you, which contradicts your own racialized reality, thereby creating a static of cognitive dissonance. They see you as they want to, not as you appear to be. And you are not allowed feelings which don't suit them, or even emotions which they don't feel comfortable about. It is these nuanced perceptions and resultant feelings which lend flavor to Asian American writing, even as the larger issues of race, culture, ethnicity, and identity feature prominently in these narratives, fictional or otherwise. Race is something, even though some of them claim that it may get out of date, it is a reality they have to live with, and they obviously cannot ignore it. So I'll start with the Japanese story, migration story. In fact, both the Chinese and the Japanese came to Hawaii in the mid 1850s. An American captain, naval captain, I think, called Murray, he went and persuaded the Japanese emperor to allow some of the Japanese people to come and work in the plantations of Hawaii. It was still not a US territory then, but these people had estates there and they needed workers. So that was a kind of agreement they made, and that allowed the Japanese to come. The Chinese had also been recruited to work there, and they had also come on their own seeking job opportunities. We'll come to that. First, the Japanese story. So from the mid 1850s onwards, the early Japanese immigrants came to Hawaii as contract plantation workers before its annexation by the USA in 1900. In fact, they came around 1869 onwards. Once Hawaii became the territory of the USA, these Japanese immigrants could cut across to the mainland USA and look for work on the West Coast. Between 1901 and 1907, 110,000 Japanese immigrated to the United States, drawn by promises of ready work and worsening economic conditions in their homeland. But most of them took the detour through Hawaii. Conditions were difficult in Hawaii. They had to work for a pittance, and so they were glad to move out. Settling in America as immigrants, the Japanese workers started looking for more opportunities beyond working in the plantations. So they also set up gardening shops, salons, and other small businesses. But already there was trouble. The people there were not very happy with these foreigners. Anyway, for the time being, they continued till migration of Asians to America was banned in 1924 by American legislation. That was the Immigration Act. Before that, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the ban was lifted in 1952, with each Asian country being allowed to send a limited number of migrants annually to the USA under the Immigration and Naturalization Act. And this obviously improved after subsequent legislation in 1965. But before that happened, the early settlers, they were known as Issei, the first generation, followed by those born on American soil as Nisei, then the Sansei, and the fourth generation were known as Yonsei. So those names became popular. Each told a story about their degrees of acceptance. Although the Japanese made up less than 2% of all the immigrants to the United States, newspapers trumpeted that as an invasion. The Asiatic Exclusion League pressed for legislation to halt all Japanese immigration. Politicians ran for office on anti-Japanese platforms. In 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which banned all immigration from Japan. Now, this was a blanket immigration act which also forbade the Chinese, who had already been banned earlier. Now, despite the ban, there were already people there, and some of the wives were allowed in, some students were allowed in. So the community flourished till Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan in the build-up to the war in 1941, and after that everything changed. So the following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, hostility turned into paranoia, and paranoia was transformed into law. a lot of you might have heard of Roosevelt's infamous order 9066, executive order, which not only banned immigrants from these regions, it also ensured that the Japanese were seen as a threat perception and were directed to occupy camps that had been set up for them. So Treasury Department ordered all Japanese-owned businesses closed and the Issei bank accounts frozen. The government had already compiled a list of Japanese whose loyalties might be suspect, and so everything was done. People who were citizens, maybe scientists, high-profile doctors or teachers, found their citizenship revoked. Most of the men were rounded up and taken in by the FBI. Some were allowed to go to the camps with their wives and children. And that continued for more than 3.5 years. And when they were allowed to come out of those camps, they were a ruined lot. So this is something which there were these camps at Manzanar or in Utah and in Washington. So north of California, in those remote desert locations where it was very hot and uncomfortable, young innocent children who knew nothing of day-to-day politics found themselves packed off there. Now, after they spent so much time under constant surveillance, it was found out by a commission that, and I read a quote from their notification, no person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States, Alaska, or Hawaii was ever charged with any act of espionage or sabotage. As one Nisei later wrote, the victims of Executive Order 9066 were people whose only crime was their face. Now, interestingly, while these people were rounded up and confined to these camps, there were a number of Niseis, that is, Japanese Americans born on American soil, second generation, who were also part of the American armed forces. So these men fighting for the US Army had some of their relatives in these camps, and the government had no issues about that. It was simply paranoia that drove them to take such actions. So this is a trauma that the Japanese people have to live with. Even decades later, they cannot help but talk about the internment in 1942 till 44, almost till 45, and then they believe in looking beyond it, not just being bitter about it. Their whole lives were shattered, everything was ruined, but the Japanese believed in being positive and looking beyond this. So they would talk about this, but then also look beyond this. And when they came out, they were given $25, which was hardly enough to even set up house. And their houses were anyway ruined when they came back to their original locations. So these Japanese American authors who wrote about these incidents continued to be troubled by the incidents during World War II. And most of their writings refer to that, in fact. I'll mention some of these. Julia Otsuka, she wrote when the emperor was divine, this is about a family. The father is a scientist, he is picked up by the FBI, and the mother and the two small children, 7 and 5 years old, they are packed off to the camp. When they come out of the camp several years later, they find that their house has been ransacked. So they had paid someone to look after it, but that man had in fact let it out to someone else, so it was ruined. They come back with just $25. And then when the father joins them on his release, he is a broken man. He cannot return to work. He is sick. He is paranoid. He gets disturbed, angry. So it is left to the mother to do housework for others because she's not given decent employment. She would take up cleaning jobs in the neighborhood and fend for themselves, provide for them. And while this happened, while they were at the camp, this young boy would often think of the Japanese emperor. Somehow it would flash in his mind, so the title When the Emperor Was Divine. Now there was another novel she wrote, The Buddha in the Attic. That was written in 2011, but that again refers back to the internment and also to another incident or phenomenon, the picture brides. These Japanese men who first came as laborers were not allowed to marry anybody from another race. They had these strict miscegenation laws in America. So by the time these men managed to reach out to their relatives at home, they sent their photographs. The photographs were not genuine representations because they were old. Anyway, they're like some of the practices may be elsewhere in the subcontinent. The photographs were seen and approved by parents, and daughters were sent as picture brides to marry these men. When they landed on the West Coast, they found that these men they were supposed to get married to or take as their partners were old and also poor. So these brides immediately were pushed into service. They had to work as cleaners or as farm workers. So life was difficult for them. And then they also looked forward to having children, thought things would improve, but the children were typical Americans, or at least pretended to be Americans. So there was a disconnect between the parents and the children. And the mothers would watch in apprehension, and they didn't have to wait long because suddenly, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, everything crashed and they all had to leave in a hurry. And that is when one of these wives left her laughing Buddha in the attic, and that is how the novel got this title. So some of these writers keep talking about that. Then there is this other man, John Okada, whose novel was written in 1957, No No Boy. No No is a condition or a catchphrase used by a person who refuses to toe the US diktats or the US line. People in internment camps who were there on suspicion of espionage were still being pressurized to join the US armed forces. Most of the people also obliged. Despite the disappointment, they tried to please the US army. But there were people who refused to sign on the dotted line, and those men were known as no-no boys or no-no men. So one such character, Ichida, comes home and he finds that he is not at all welcome because everybody is ashamed of him for having said no. Why? He spends 2 years in the internment camp, then he is again imprisoned in a proper prison for 2 years for saying no. And when he comes back, he finds it is very difficult to fit in with the community because most of them disapprove of him. Finally, it is another former army man who appreciates what led him to take that decision. And there are lots of experiences that he to go through before he realizes that maybe life is worth living. He should again try to fit into the community. There are also other novels like Kira Kira by Cynthia Kadohata. And she writes about Japanese people who work hard but also retain a positive frame of mind, about families who work not on the West Coast but in the American South and struggle, but then they're still happy to look at the shimmer. The Kira Kira word probably refers to some kind of shimmer in the sky. So Japanese writers overall felt that they could live with all the shame and injustice, and it was only during Ronald Reagan's time that their demands for compensation were met, and they were given some kind of compensation for their experience at these internment camps. So it took a long time, at least for people to recognize that such things happened to citizens, not just migrants. Now, the Chinese story, again, it started in the mid-1850s, but these Chinese came also as gold prospectors. They heard about the California gold rush somehow, somewhere, and they thought they could also join them. Apart from working in the Hawaii plantations. So for them, Gold Mountain was California, where in 1840, can you hear me now? I found I had muted myself suddenly. I didn't realize
Yes.
that. Sorry,
Now
I
we
didn't.
can.
Yeah, you should have sent me off. Actually, sorry. Somehow I maybe pressed something. So Japanese lived with their humiliation, but they didn't want to complain. So they were seen as a model minority despite all the suspicion. Even after the internment, they had to live with a lot of humiliation. The Chinese at that time were acceptable. So, but that was much later. Before that, the Chinese came, and they came with technical know-how. Even in those days, the Chinese somehow had knowledge of mining, of irrigation, and also of advanced farming. And they also worked on those railroads in central USA. So they were acceptable, but once they started earning money, they combined their forces to purchase deserted mines and somehow found a little gold in these rejected or deserted mines. And that is when people got again jealous and started levying heavy taxes on these Chinese. That was in the 19th century. So because of this influx of immigrants, there was a heavy population in California, especially San Francisco. By 1850, San Francisco had grown into the city of more than 30,000 people. By the time the Chinese began arriving by the thousands in 1851, San Francisco had become one of the biggest cities in the United States. New Chinese arrivals wasted no time in joining many others in working the mines of California. And approximately 85% or more of the 20,000 Chinese in California by 1852 worked in the mines. From working on these mines, they rose to becoming also owners of some of these mines. So some of them struck gold, others obviously continued to struggle. Now, apart from mining, they brought construction skills. They were the ones who dug tunnels and also set up the railroad. But then credit was given to the white workforce. So these miners dammed up rivers with pine trees. They allowed the miners to control the flow of water. This allowed them to control the flow of water so that they could use its power to speed up the digging and sifting process. As the Chinese grew more successful in the gold mines, the white miners began to get angry at them. They were envious of the success of the Chinese, and white miners even took to violence. So there was literally physical violence and also the economic pushback, the taxes levied on them, and there was a lot of unfair practices at that time on these people. Then apart from these public working places, they also set up small businesses for the needs of the Chinese community, maybe small restaurants, salons, or grocery shops. So their financial position drew the attention of other settlers. Especially there were these Irish settlers at that time. They were themselves immigrants who took up the case against these Chinese and created a lot of trouble for them. So there was this Los Angeles massacre of 1871. A mob of around 500 white and Hispanic persons entered Chinatown and attacked, bullied, and killed them. Some men were also killed and literally lynched. About 18 or 19 of them, I think. So by 1876, the Chinese were seen as proper enemies, and all the public activity led to the framing of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then that act that was for a limited period, but then they kept stretching it, kept extending it. And in 1924, when the Immigration Act was signed, the earlier act was still very much being practiced, and so the Chinese were away for quite some time. Now, given this kind of a blanket ban on the Chinese and then the Japanese becoming unpopular after Pearl Harbor, the Koreans were allowed in. But before that, during the Second World War, when Japan attacked America, the Chinese supported American forces because Japan had also invaded China. So in Japan, they found a common enemy, and the Chinese then became again acceptable. So people would even go around with badges on them claiming they were Chinese, so that people would not attack them as Japanese. So the situation kept flipping depending on the US relations with their erstwhile homelands. Now, interestingly, something happened. These Chinese people were not totally innocent at all times. In 1906, there was a fire in San Francisco. No, it was in, I think, Los Angeles. And the registry of births and deaths was burned down. So the Chinese immigrants took that opportunity to claim that they were proper citizens. Those who were still immigrants in a transitional state claimed that they were citizens, and there was no way they could actually throw away their claims since all the documents had been lost. So as citizens, they could again now bring in their children from China. And that is when they acted as intermediaries for the passage of men they did not know but claimed as paper sons. So that is how the paper sons, the word came in. Like the picture brides, the paper sons were unknown young men who would be claimed once they landed by someone as their son. Now the authorities also got suspicious and they started asking them questions which would again be then put to the father on the mainland. But then these people got smart and the men who came to America were trained back home on the nature of the questions that would be asked or about the location and home address so that they would at least be on the same page. So that is how more and more men came in despite the strict laws. So some of these Chinese writers, now Chinese writers do not talk about those things much, although they once in a while mention the fact of paper sons or picture brides. Like Fei Manning's Bone, which was written in 1993, talks about the person Leon being a paper son to someone who had given him shelter in America. Or Amiton's Joy Luck Club celebrates motherhood and women who seek some kind of space for themselves. There were others like Girl in Translation by Jean Kyok, written in 2010. Hajin, this was a man writing about a free life. So there were men and women in China, America, of Chinese descent, who were producing these immigrant or migrant fictions, but they were also under pressure to produce autobiographical narratives, and a number of them actually wrote, sometimes even more than one, like Lisa C. wrote on Gold Mountain, then An Chi Min wrote a couple. One was a cooked seed. Cooked seed means you are already done. So this girl who was a part of Madame Mao's group was already ruined in China before she fled and came to America. So she was a cooked seed. So there were narratives, both fictional and non-fictional. We'll come to Bone again. I just briefly mentioned these. Then the Korean story. The Koreans, as I mentioned, came also as laborers, but also as later on proper intellectuals. Now, Korea had been under Japanese rule for quite some time. And then when the Japanese left at the end of Second World War, Russia stepped in and there was a turf war between Russia and America over Korean territory. As a result, a lot of Korea was divided into North and South Korea, and a lot of Koreans fled from communist rule. Then earlier, there were these Koreans who had also come as part of the missionary initiative as Christians. So when the Chinese and the Japanese were not very acceptable at a time, these Koreans were acceptable. They filled in the gap. And they also had their picture brides and small businesses and salons. And whether it was the Chinese or the Japanese, Koreans, they set up these Chinatowns or Koreatowns where the members of a community lived in close proximity, governed by their own code of ethics or their own even code of conduct, and they tried to preserve their own culture. Now, Koreans were allowed to come in again in 1950s after the Second World War. Then in the 60s, when so some of the rules were first relaxed by President Kennedy, then by Lyndon Johnson, allowing in 65 skilled migrants to come to America. Now, some of these Korean narratives, just briefly wait. I'll need a little more time, Vinny, can I? Because I'm still talking about the history. Then I'll just briefly talk about a couple of narratives. There were some of those early writers like Yang Hil Kang, who wrote East Goes West. Deals with the experience of a young man who arrives in the USA with no funds and then experiences life in different sectors. Later on, Chang Really wrote Native Speaker. He's an American academic. Where the second generation Henry Park tries to fit into his American surroundings, but is left wondering at other people's ability to assimilate with mainstream American society. Patty Kim wrote a novel called A Cab Named Reliable, where a young girl sees her mother disappearing with her young brother one day. All she remembers is that the cab was called Reliable and the mother never turns up. The mother had promised to collect her, but she disappears into the American maze, and this girl is left with her drunken father in America, but then away from her mother. How these families sometimes disintegrate on American soil. That is what is shown there. There were some others, like A Step from Heaven, then Suki Kim's Interpreter, which deals with crucial aspects of community life and betrayal within the community. There's also Min Jin Lee's Free Food for Millionaires, talking about workplace problems. And so some of these Korean American narratives throw light upon some aspects of the dilemmas and complications faced by immigrants and their descendants. The suspicion and lack of sympathy between different migrant groups in America against the background of official apathy or worse, clinical hostility is often addressed in these narratives. They feel compelled to look beyond the obvious picture which was produced to meet US expectations. There were other fissures, nuances which they felt they had to touch upon, and sometimes even the genre was fixed for them. Fiction or autobiography was forced on them. So sometimes now we find like Kathy Park, the Korean, her American, her book is a mixture of it's an essay, but then there are different kinds of inputs there. And then she talks about the writer of Dictee, Teresa Park Kyung-ja. She wrote Dictee, maybe it was around 1986, and she was also murdered in 1986. She was raped and murdered by a white security guard in New York. She was newly married, and the US authorities didn't even consider her murder worth investigating. It was left to her two grown-up brothers and her American husband to search in the basement of the building where he worked, and they came up with a few clues, and gradually they convinced the police to look up and investigate the matter. So how justice is denied to these immigrants, and in this Dictee, this lady too, Teresa Cha, combines poetry, fictional accounts plus observations in her narrative. She was also a filmmaker, although she had trained as a filmmaker in Paris. So their narratives also contest the established genres that we can write like this, not simply as a poet or as a novelist, but just putting down our thoughts. So I'd just like to highlight some of the problems in the later narratives. One is the obvious problem of tension at the workplace. Migrant women or migrant men, they find that they are often not given full justice. They are not given promotion, or they are sidelined. Somehow they are overlooked. So some Now these people get ambitious, they're either thrown out or forced to resign. But it is only for the white man or woman, especially the insider. That is also something they come to realize, that it's not every white man who succeeds. He has to be from that particular set, the exclusive club, the insider club, to gain maybe a partnership or a promotion. So this kind of tension at the workplace was something men and women both faced, but women more so because there were also sexual contours to that, not just harassment, but women were forced to dress smartly. Also, sometimes their sexuality was denied, so that they were expected to play ball with men in the park, sometimes to prove their maybe physical health. So I'll just refer to a novel by Helen Wan, Chinese American, called The Partner Trap. This lady, Ingrid Jung, had got a job in a high profile law firm. Somehow she thought she was breaking barriers, maybe by getting selected there. And she tries to work her way up the ladder. She's very hardworking, very intelligent, but she finds that she is there simply to tick a particular box. She is the colored woman there. Then there is also an African American man who also happens to be gay. So he also helps the firm to tick a particular box that they are liberal about people's sexual orientations. So that particular firm had in fact run into some social criticism for being narrow-minded. And so they had taken on this diversity project. And as an extension of the diversity project, they not only brought these or pushed these people to promote that project, but they realized that they were maybe the early representatives of that initiative. So it was not their intelligence, their hard work, their ability that counted, but because they filled a particular gap, one person representing a particular community to suggest that these people, these upper crust privileged white men are rather liberal. And once this lady steps outside the office, she meets a friendly white woman who offers her a job as a nanny. So the feeling that Asian American women, if they are young and healthy, would make good nannies. Here is a top grade lawyer being offered friendly advice and an opportunity to act as a nanny from a helpful white woman, not someone who wants to shame her. So how they try to pigeonhole these people? Asian American young women would make good nannies, and that is that they are not expected to be in any high profile position. So at the workplace, this racial profiling was very strong. And when this woman tried to also push her way to the top, she was again viciously marginalized and not considered, and it also led to her leaving the firm. So the dynamics of the workplace, whether it is in the lowly paid workplaces where women are taken advantage of, not being paid enough as the men, or in the corporate sector where your ability counts, not your physical clout, still it is the connections you make or your family connections which count. So these are realities that Asian Americans have to live with. Not just the color of the skin or their family background, but also the connections with those privileged white Americans who would be willing to back their case. So that is something which Helen Wan's partner track deals with. Then there is this other novel, Suki Kim's interpreter. Now here, this is a Korean American novel. This was published in 2013. Suki Kim talks about a young lady who acts as an interpreter and sees something which opens her eyes to the reality of US regulations. Then again, in the background is the story of this lady's parents, the Parks. She's Susie Park. Her father and mother, the Parks, when the novel opens, have been killed 5 years ago. They had lived in the Koreatown in New York, but they had not been on good terms with the community because the parents did not allow them to mix freely. They were rather aloof, but they still followed Korean rituals or lived life the Korean way, promoting Korean culture. It was discovered much later that Susie's father, Mr. Park, had acted as a link for the immigration service. So he would somehow betray all the new immigrants who had sought his help in that enclave. So here was a man living within the community who was supposed to help them, even translate things for them, facilitate things for him, but he was using them to maybe promote his chances with the US authorities. And he was also hitting out at some of his adversaries. Whoever outdid him in some business deal, the small businessmen, he would ensure that they were deported, because there were all kinds of immigrants, some documented, some just residents, and some obviously citizens. So for these people whose situation was rather tenuous, they were at his mercy. So the community got to know of this and engaged a gang from within the community. So that puts a question mark over the community. It is normally believed that in immigrant narratives or in real immigrant locations or colonies, these townships that they set up, the community is very important. It is. It protects them, it teaches them their culture, even provides a kind of assistance mechanism. It helps them to get jobs and even medical aid or even banking system. The Koreans call it GEI, G-E-I. They, instead of putting their money in the banks, they put their money with their fellow Koreans and often also get cheated. So the idea of community, which traditional narratives had, that it was always the support system, could be also seen as a double-edged sword. Sometimes the community helps, sometimes the community, there were members within the community who somehow attacked their fellow members, and the community at large could not protect them from these acts of betrayal or even petty corruption. So a lot of people found their savings robbed, and Mr. Park, because he was onto this dangerous work, was discovered finally, and the community thought they could threaten them by engaging Korean gangsters. But somehow one of them took a shot and the Parks were killed. So the daughter comes to know about this 5 years later. And these daughters, one of them is shocked. The elder daughter finds out that it is her boyfriend who was one of the gang leaders and who had killed her. So she decides to kill her boyfriend because her Korean values tell her that, her community values tell her that she should avenge her parents' murder. And so the person's identity, his position in life, these things are also controlled or sometimes influenced by the community. How you grow within the community or how the community shapes your attitude to life. Even if these two girls happen to live somewhat away from the community because their parents did not allow them to mix freely, still the elder sister ends up doing this. Now this younger girl, Susie Park, acts as an interpreter, and she finds that one old Korean American woman is up for deportation. She had been in America for 25 years. She had come to do a MA in fine arts. So she was a graduate, but her parents went bankrupt, so she couldn't go back. She entered a marriage of convenience with a greengrocer and continued to live with him for 25 years. It was a loveless marriage, but one day while she was setting up salads that she had prepared, there was this young African American girl who started pulling up tins from her shop, stealing. And there was a scuffle, and then when that young teenage African American girl started hitting out at this lady, her name is Mrs. Choi, she had the knife because she was making salad. She used that knife to just stab the girl in her hand. It was not serious or life-threatening, but on the pretext that an African American or a citizen had been attacked by an immigrant woman or someone of immigrant stock, she was immediately arrested, jailed for 3 years, and after 3 years of jail time, she is called up before the court, and she doesn't want to explain anything. And her husband has not backed her cause. He has not bothered to appear in court. He's not interested. Her daughter has gone away somewhere. She is not interested. So seeing this dysfunctional family, the authorities glibly decide that if they deport her, she will not, they will not be affecting any family dynamics. Now, this woman who came to America as a young girl, as a student, in her late middle age, she's around 58 or 9. She will be deported, she knows, but she has nothing to say in her defense because what can she say? She knows she's being treated unfairly, but then the betrayal of her husband and daughter, who are not interested, only help the authorities, white authorities, to justify their cause that this woman is worthless, she is given to violence, and she is up for deportation. And Susie tries to persuade her to speak up, but she says, no, I have withstood jail, withstood everything. And so she says she will withstand everything. She doesn't know what lies ahead of her in Korea. She has no links anymore, but that is what happens to some of these Asian American residents. She never got her citizenship. She never bothered with her papers, but she was not undocumented either. She was a resident. And that is how she lived, and that is how she'll be dumped. So sometimes their positions are absolutely shaky, irrevocable at the moment. And how an Asian American is used to defend the African American who would have been maybe anyway killed by the police. Had the police been called to the scene, she would have been shot dead. But because there was a scuffle and this woman struck her with the knife she was using to chop fruit, she is hauled up as a criminal and the young girl escapes. So how they are used against each other. And that is something these Asian American writers realize, that how they are used sometimes as maybe examples against the Black community to show them how these people are hardworking and uncomplaining, and sometimes maybe to counter their own positions or shake their positions by using them against the Blacks to support the claims of the African Americans, even if they are maybe in the wrong. So there was no sense of justice in this novel. So it's at one a murder mystery about the parents' murder. The girl comes to know much later that it was the their own community had got rid of her parents because the father was dangerous against the health of the community. But at the same time, she sees something which leaves her with mixed feelings about Asian Americans and their lot in America. So that is the interpreter. And just a little about the Chinese American novel Born by Fei Mian-ning, N.G. Sunny. Born again about three sisters. Here again talking about the community. In this case, the community is very strong. The mother is supported by the community. The father is a sailor, their stepfather, but he is kind to them. And the only job he knows is acting as a sailor. So whenever he runs out of money, he goes to sea on some ship that engages him. Once when he makes some money, he decides that they would set up a dry cleaning shop with another partner, and they enter into what is known as a gentleman's agreement, and soon finds that the partner swindles them and they lose all their savings, and there was no legal document, no bank deposit, so they are ruined. And that also ruins the relationships between the two families. Now, this one family which lost out had 3 daughters, and the middle daughter, Ona, was engaged to their son, the other partner's son. So this ruined business deal also affects family relationships. At one time, the family had promoted that alliance. Now they forbid this girl from even meeting this young man called Oswaldo, whom she loves. So she's on one side pulled by her boyfriend, on the other by the demands from her parents about Chinese values, loyalty, truth, faith, all these things. And finally, because she's pulled 2 ways and she's also a loyal Chinese girl, she decides to take her own way out. She wanted to leave the household through marriage, but now when her marriage is prevented, she jumps from a high-rise building and kills herself. So that is when again the community rallies around them. This woman, the mother is a seamstress. The other women who work in the shop with her come and offer her comfort on terms that she understands. Just as in Toni Morrison, we find in Beloved, Seti and Denver are offered help by the women of the community. So also here, the women rally around her, help her to overcome her grief and ensure that she gets her bearings right. So out of the 3 daughters in that family, the youngest daughter just leaves for the city. The middle daughter commits suicide. The eldest daughter, who is a devoted daughter and a sibling, also now has marriage plans with an American man, and she feels guilty because she feels that maybe she shouldn't be thinking about herself but her aged parents. So living within the community, you also subscribe to certain feelings of guilt and other community feelings, which do not always leave you with the space to decide or determine your own life. And if you leave it also, you feel that you have committed an act of betrayal. So these are the 3 novels. I'll just sum up with a couple of points, I think, which we find common in migration narratives. That the retention of ethnic identities, even in these, we find that finally they find that since that color won't sell, or it will always be there, they're called color. The way Kamala Harris nowadays is called a woman of color, even if she's the vice president, doesn't matter. Woman of color sums her up. So they realize that it is better to have their own ethnic identities, the bracketed thing. Now, Kathy Park, who wrote Minor Feelings, she mentions that this word Asian American was coined in the University of Berkeley in 1968 by the Asian American students, because the African Americans were rooting for their own identities. The Asian Americans also felt that they should now make a case for themselves. But the writers feel that there is nothing about aggression or activism there. They just want to tell their stories, or at least offer a critique of life, or hold a mirror to certain nuances in their lives, even in their everyday lives, certain fissures which are not even seen or noticed by the mainstream white community. So sometimes they end up with the cultural identities of their parents. So the retention of ethnic identities among the diasporic migrant communities is not a defensive strategy, but aimed at distinctiveness and empowerment within the host country and also the country of origin. This happens naturally in children in the form of a transcultural identity combining parental tradition and new culture or cultures. With the older generation operating between nostalgia and hope in the American present, assimilation into American society is never complete. At home, they have one language and culture of some kind of food items. Elsewhere, they have a different kind of culture. Initially, they do not like what their parents impose on them, but gradually they realize that that is the only reality for them. Hyphenation, therefore, is a major key of migrant self-fashioning and disavowal. This hyphenated identity was at one time a label, even by the white society, branding them Korean American or Chinese American. Now they find that they are proud to hold up that identity or answer to that identity, even if they don't have any claims with China or Korea or Japan. So in the case of the younger generation, their natural inclination towards a Pan-American identity notwithstanding, there is a renewed interest in their parents' cultural ties to the erstwhile homeland in Asia. This interest, fanned by the politics of ethnic difference and the resurgence of the community in democratic America, encourages them to think of themselves as bearers of hyphenated identities. This hyphenation, interestingly, does not signal a return to Asia or whatever their place of origin, but an attempt to bridge two cultures to lend a wider dimension to the earlier sense of American identity. And it also prevents them from being lumped together as Asian Americans. They are Korean or Chinese or Filipino or Indian or Pakistani American. Why should they all be called Asian Americans, or even those from the Middle East as Arab Americans, which also includes the Persians who are not Arabs at all? So assertion of their own ethnic identities helps to make their difference clear. Now, the displacements necessitated by migration and settlement elsewhere in America, in this case, lead to discoveries of new frontiers, both literally and in terms of American identity. Each wave of migration to America is connected with and controlled by communities, facilitating the entry of people sharing similarities of class, gender. Now, this is something which is true of contemporary migration, and those illegal and maybe illicit kind of migrations. They facilitate the entry of people they know who go to America in search of jobs, then find themselves working in what they call sweatshops, which are actually small factories or workplaces where they have to work hard for a very low income. So the community sometimes also acts as a rallying point, or sometimes also as a channel for these migrants, but then it works both ways. It helps and it also pressurizes them into accepting their lot. So neither identity nor community can be taken as complete or fixed or stable. Earlier, they used to have what they call not only these ethnic enclaves, they also tried to establish so-called homogenized corridors, maybe leading to another pocket elsewhere. But gradually, people didn't bother with the community or the ethnic enclave, and they sought their own dwelling places or occupations and their own maybe peer group, and so that did not take off much later. At one time, that was important for them. I just want to end with a couple of quotes from Kathy Park Hong. Again, we go back to minor feelings because she points to the reality of Asian Americans and Asian American writing. So she talks about minor feelings. I take a couple of lines from her. Minor feelings are also the emotions we are accused of having when we decide to be difficult. In other words, when we decide to be honest. When minor feelings are finally externalized, these are not earth-shattering movements, nothing happens, but immigrants are entitled to those feelings. So she says, they are interpreted as hostile, ungrateful, jealous, depressing, and belligerent affects ascribed to racialized behavior that whites consider out of line. Our feelings are overreactions because our lived experience of structured iniquity are not commensurate with their deluded reality. They expect you to toe the line, they expect you to fit a particular frame or a model. If you speak up or if you deviate slightly, even if you are in the right, they will reject you or say that you have done something unforgivable. So she goes on another point. She says, whether our families come from Guatemala, Afghanistan, or South Korea, the immigrants since 1965 have shared histories that extend beyond this nation to our countries of origin, where our lineage has been decimated by Western imperialism, war, and dictatorships orchestrated or supported by the United States. Earlier migrant narratives were about gratitude, about celebration of America, about also the horrible conditions and the trauma they left back home in the erstwhile homeland. But then things might have been bad, but it was also because of US intervention. The meddling in Korea, the meddling in Vietnam, which I haven't talked about, but most of you probably know. After that mess, people from Vietnam had to be taken to America by US ships to save them from the communists. So migrations take place, according to her, because of US meddling and US intervention, maybe sometimes even altruistic, but then somehow they end up messing things so that these people need an escape route. So the other day when I saw that the US was withdrawing from Afghanistan, and I saw a few people complaining that their lives were at risk because they had acted as interpreters for the US Army, I thought maybe now there would be more of these Afghanis getting a passage to America. So that is how things happen, and people expect gratitude. That is what Kathy Park Hong talks about. In our efforts to belong in America, I'll finish up soon, Krishna. In our efforts to belong in America, we act grateful as if we've been given a second chance at life. But our shared root is not the opportunity this nation has given us, but how the capitalist accumulation of white supremacy has enriched itself of the blood of our countries. We cannot forget this. So even if they manage to make a life for themselves, they did not also forget the reality which started their flight, why they had to flee, and why some of them, even in America, were in constant flight. So what should these Asian American writers write? Can they talk directly about this messing up of US geopolitics or of the racism in the country or the tensions? Or should they maybe talk near the subject? So Kathy Hong again quotes another academic, Trinity Mina. So Trinity Mina, she teaches literature as well as she's a filmmaker, and Kathy Hong quotes her. She's from Michigan, I think, Trinity Mina. So she says, talking about things nearby instead of talking directly on the subject, hitting the nail on the head, and maybe assuming a kind of authority over the situation, why don't we talk near it? So this is what she says, I quote, when you decide to speak nearby rather than speak about, the first thing you need to do is to acknowledge the possible gap between you and those who populate your film. In other words, to leave the space of representation open so that although you are very close to your subject, you're also committed to not speaking on their behalf, in their place, or on top of them. You can only speak nearby, in proximity, whether the other is physically present or absent, which requires that you deliberately suspend meaning, preventing it from merely closing and hence leaving a gap in the formation process. This allows the other person to come in and fill that space as they wish. By not trying to assume a position of authority in relation to the other, you are actually freeing yourself from the endless criteria generated with such an all-knowing claim and its hierarchies in knowledge. Unquote. So this is Trinity Minhas talking about speaking nearby the subject, and Kathy Hong quotes this from Trinity Minhas interview given elsewhere in her book. With that, I end my talk. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak, and sorry about shooting off the time limit. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was an insightful lecture on Asian American migration narratives with special reference to Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. Even though these narratives, like your lecture unveiled the fact that even though these narratives were autobiographical in nature, they were sociological too. And these stories, which often dealt with these stories of selves that often dealt with the horrors, the cultural shock, exclusion, racial suppression, and so on. You explained how they became part of a larger framework of American immigration. And these, it also told us how these narratives, which were very complex and layered and varied in nature, how they challenged how these different diversities challenged the stereotypical representation of their life. So thank you so much, ma'am. So as per the format of our lecture series, Krishnan sir is the first one who should respond to your lecture. So I invite Krishnan sir to respond to the lecture.
Just one thing, just one minute, Krishnan. They were not all autobiographical, but the pressure from the market was that they would be taken as autobiographical. They're not autobiographical. Some maybe, not all.
Yes. Okay, the norms of the published.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was a wonderful lecture, a demonstration of very scholarly, erudite combination of the analytical, of the narrative, and also of the theoretical, that actually goes into an entire tradition of immigrant narration, especially from these Asian writers. And thank you, Nivya, for very beautifully summarizing the arguments of Dr. Many things that I wanted to probably mention have already been mentioned by Nivya. So I have only a couple of remarks to make. Maybe even as students of, or people who claim to be students of American literature, it is really remarkable and in a way regrettable that such a very rich tradition, an area within American literature, if I may say so, has been largely ignored by mainstream American scholars. So thank you for once again inviting our attention to this particular area. Maybe with the exception of someone like say Amy Tan or maybe a couple of other writers, we are largely unaware of the contributions of these writers. And as rightly pointed out by Nivya, perhaps, these are all in a way stories of narratives of attempts of assimilation with the American culture. So I have only a couple of remarks to make or maybe seek clarifications from or react to, or I would ask Dr. Farheena to react to a couple of issues that crop up in my mind. One is you appear to maybe consciously avoid using the term diaspora. You kept on repeating several other words which maybe sort of verged on the notion of the diaspora. Similarly, you also kept away from the word home. Home and diaspora. Are these two terms relevant or probably not relevant in your scheme of things as you approached it? That is probably one point that over which I would like you to respond. And the other one perhaps is, see, we have these narratives which are all set in America. But to what extent do they actually qualify to be called American writing? American, because we have traditions or we have writers of the likes of, for instance, someone like say Meenakshi Mukherjee, Bharati Mukherjee, who claim to be an American writer of Indian origin. Or we have writers like say Jhumpa Lahiri, who actually get there from a different tradition, not directly from India, but her parents are, or she was born in England and all. So they all reach America maybe different ways through different paths. So in that particular kind of context, how do these narratives maybe compare well with such other traditions of narratives, fictional or non-fictional writers? That is probably another thing that I would like you to respond to. See, we know that the issue of translocation, these are all migration narratives. So one of the central issues is translocation for various reasons. So in the case of a country like India, so I happen to actually get back to India all the time. Sorry. In the case of a country like India, we know that translocation is to a great extent occasioned by post-colonial situation. But in the case of these writers, we know that it was probably not post-colonial situation that prompted their migration to America. And similarly, we know or we have heard or we have read somewhere that even before the mainstream migration from Europe began, it was followed by these migrations. There had actually been migrations onto the American mainland from the other side, from Asian countries. So culturally, how do these migrations in different periods of time compare? So these are only some issues, some maybe random thoughts that came to my mind, to which if you feel like you can probably respond.
Let me try. You spoke of several things. I don't know about the migration before the thing. From Asia earlier. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
What I know is in the 19th century.
I say that because
century.
even these things actually take place in California and on the western coast. And
no, they first came to Hawaii.
Yeah.
Okay, Krishnan, they first came to Hawaii as laborers. That I know, and then they followed as miners. when they heard of the gold rush. But they were persuaded first. But then the Chinese and the Japanese had been moving. They had also made their way to South America. So there might be records that I don't know of, that they might have also landed here and there on the west coast, okay, across the ocean. So they might have come there. I'm not sure. I don't use the term diaspora. It is used by writers, but they consider America their home. Even the Japanese who faced the internment camps chose to stay behind. Okay. And they consider themselves American, even if Japanese American in the eyes of others, they are Americans. There were some men, some Chinese, and maybe also some of these Koreans and Japanese who returned home. Okay. There is this Korean novel, The Burger King. This man became a success in the 20th century as a Burger King, forgot his name, and he went back. But he got into a lot of corrupt deals in America, so there was a kind of flight motive there as well. But there were other return migrations, but not complete return. Maybe some Chinese workers and Japanese workers went back once they made money. That was their motive. They wanted to earn money, they went back. The rest had made America their home. So they were not thinking of their erstwhile homelands as home. Maybe as a place to visit, as an exotic place. Sometimes they had fond memories they would visit, or as a kind of pilgrimage. So these writers who talk about them, even Kathy Hong and this lady who wrote Dicty and was murdered, Teresa Cha, they had also been to Korea to see life there in Seoul, but they knew that that was not their life. Okay. And that is what happens, I feel, with a lot of other migrants as well. You might also know of Maya Angelou making the trip to Ghana when there was this invitation from President Nkrumah after 1957, once he took over as president, invited all the Americans, African Americans, to, if they like, to try making their homes in Ghana along with Dr. Du Bois. So some of these people who were marginal, they also thought they would go to Ghana with a lot of hope, but they realized it was not for them, that it was a different life, and the people in Ghana had no idea of their sacrifices of slavery, so they were not given special treatment. But then Maya Angelou found that she was recognized by someone in a village, so maybe her forefathers came from that village, she realized. So she had at least found something from that visit. But Malcolm X was alive at that time. Just before his assassination, he persuaded her to come back to America. She was coming to join him in his political activity, but then a week after she landed in America, Malcolm X was killed. So that is, anyway, digressing things a bit. Now about it. The other thing, Jhumpa Lahiri, she doesn't even claim to be fully Indian, does she? She writes in it. Bharati Mukherjee, yes, she's there. But the special thing about these Asian Americans, these three nations, although Filipinos also suffered, they were of US territory till 1946. So they had access. They were Christians and they were part of the US domain. So they came the way the Puerto Ricans and others have access to the US. But these three nations had legislation against them. There were a string of laws from the 1880s till their dilution bit by bit till the 50s. So these were nations who had drawn the attention of the American public through their industry and their enterprise. And they also went in such huge numbers to America that white Americans felt somewhat threatened by their success. So these cases are special. The Vietnamese obviously suffered. The Cambodians went. They were allowed access in the 60s. Those were traumatized people who had to go. Unlike the Indians, that is why the case is different. Indians went only for maybe advancement, or maybe some had some ambitions to fulfill, they left. But the flight motive was not there. there was a stable government in India. Unlike maybe Pakistan or the Arab countries, now the people are again running away from war or the Iranian revolution. So elsewhere, India is special in the whole of this Asian American group, that India has always had a stable government, whatever the nature, and also a stable culture. Unlike what colonialism did to Africa through the imposition of foreign languages, they crushed their culture. They couldn't do anything to Indian culture. In Assam, we had a special kind of thing. Instead of Assamese, Bengali was made the mother tongue. Okay, from 1930s to 1870 or 73. So Assamese people were forced to study in Bangla schools and master a language. And that apparently was only for politics or for good business. The Bangla publishers wanted to do good business by producing textbooks for Assam. And when the Assamese writers succeeded in convincing the British government that they had a good enough mother tongue, one of the writers, whose name was Lokinath Bejbora, he was married to Tagore's niece. So he was part of that family, but he was from Assam. He mentions a conversation with Tagore. Tagore told him that you have ruined the business for these Bengali publishers. You have got your nationalism, you have got your language again reinstated. Assamese schools will start teaching Assamese, but then you have ruined business for it. So that was the politics there. So unlike the rest of India, Assamese people had that particular issue. In Orissa also probably there was this imposition of Bangla for some time. So such problems are there in post-colonial situations. But then India still, I think, India had a better lot. They went maybe to improve their status, like some went as ordinary unskilled laborers, some as semi-skilled laborers, some as even skilled laborers. But one thing about these people, Koreans and Chinese, although they were maybe qualified doctors, engineers, whatever, they had to make concessions in America. For quite some time, they were not given jobs commensurate with their qualifications. They were forced to start a repair shops or maybe a laundry. An engineer would be running a laundry, so they had to make compromises. But the political situation was such in their country that they had to still survive in America at any cost. Okay. There were others who also took to academics, but then decided to be poets and things like that. There are other novels as well. I haven't mentioned them. So it is still in a case in process. Asian Americans still trying to define themselves, the nature of their writing, and they're discovering more and more dark, shady zones or fissures which they could unravel maybe. And it depends how much, but then another thing, they have to write for the market to sell. And Kathy Hong also mentions in my note that if you do what you want to do, you may not end up pleasing the white audience for whom you write. So just as our poets used to complain about the market controlling aesthetic standards, whether Browning or Pound or anybody down the ages, they used to complain about the market controlling the things, the standards of art. Here too, the nature of writing is still somewhat determined by the expectations of the white reading public. And that is also supported by the market. Yeah. Was there anything else I forgot, maybe?
No, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I just wanted to ask you maybe a couple of questions more. You just mentioned the kind of relationship between, say, the Bengalis and Assamese. We are coming back to it.
But that is because
is that what you call this Bengali Babu?
No, see, all the jobs are taken over by them still. Okay.
Yeah.
But there are Bangla schools still in Assam, but at one time, all our forefathers landed up in Bangla schools struggling with a language they didn't understand initially.
Yeah, incidentally, actually, what is the script that you use for Assamese?
No, it's similar. Okay, only the ra is different. So because the script is similar, it was convenient for the Bengalis to push.
You sent me yesterday, in the picture that you sent me yesterday of the earthquake.
Yeah, it was written in Assamese.
I suppose I could see the Bengali, or is it Assamese?
Assamese.
It's
Only the
quite
ra.
like Bengali. Yeah. Okay.
The ra sound is there's a line, dividing line in Assamese. In
Only you
Bengali, there's a
understand.
dot under.
We don't. Yeah. Okay.
You wouldn't understand.
Okay.
No, see, that is the similarity between Chinese and Japanese also. The ra sound is missing from Chinese, so they call liksha. And the Japanese don't have ra. So Li Po, the poet, became Rihaku in Japanese. Okay. So a person could sight translate from one language to another and assume some kind of control over both, although it was not actually true. So those things happen.
Okay, now for the others, it's for the floor. Open to the floor.
Now the session is open for discussion. So we'll take the questions together, as there is heavy rain, thunder, and lightning. Some of their batteries are running out, so because of that, we'll take the questions together.
Only make sure I get to know, because if there are too many, I may forget. Okay, so pass them on to me.
Yes.
There was a storm here today. So the university Wi-Fi is gone. Fortunately, we have taken the BSNL, so we're managing today.
If you have any mic issues, you can even type the questions in the chat box.
Yes.
But I expect Teresa to ask some questions.
They don't have questions probably. No problem.
It's like it's an entirely new area.
I have taken so much of your time anyway.
Now, I think since it's 3 years, some of the students texted us that they have only 5% charge.
Yeah, exactly.
So some of them
let them
just
go.
had to leave because of that.
Questions can keep for another day. They can still send them to Winnie or somebody. I can answer later. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So now we are coming to, I hope there are no questions. Okay. So now we are coming to the concluding part of our session. So we have successfully completed our lecture series. So for the vote of thanks, I'll be inviting Winnie Rani. But before she delivers the vote of thanks, I want to add that Winnie is the one who took the initiative for this lecture series. And in fact, she is our chief organizer. She's the chief organizer of this series. So definitely she needs to be acknowledged. So thank you, Winnie. So now I call Winnie to deliver the word of thanks.
That was uncalled for. It was a group effort. First of all, we thought we would talk a little bit about the entire lecture series before the session begins, but as we know, it's a very tight session. We didn't get time, and now people are in a very bad state because of the rain and storming and thunderstorm. All these things are happening around us. So I think we will also write things up there in our group. First of all, I would love to thank Dr. Farheena Danta. Ma'am, it was such a thorough analytical paper that you have presented. it took some time for us to actually digest and follow up every aspect of what you've said, and I think people are still digesting of what you are saying. There are so many writers you've mentioned, of course, who are not working in American literature would get inspired from what you have said, and I'm sure they will also try to understand the dynamics of uh, racial existence within in American society, since we have been witnessing violence against Asian Americans in recent days, and also clashes between various races. The increasing racialization in the American society and everywhere else. In fact, along with extreme right wing uh, activism. So, in that sense, ma'am, thank you so much for presenting this paper to us. Uh, and I'm sure we would definitely collect questions and send to you through mail. It's because of the technical issues that people are not able to ask questions. So I'm apologizing for that. But I extend my sincere thanks to Farheena ma'am for giving us this wonderful lecture. And we all know that she's one of the earliest friends of Krishnan sir, and I'm sure that sir will also be extremely happy to have you in this floor. And we, in that sense, feel really proud that uh, we were able to bring you to this gathering, and also obviously our beloved Krishnan sir, he has been here throughout all our lectures. Of course, it's to honor him, but even then he has responded every time with more sensible questions, and it encouraged all of us to ask more and more questions and ponder about what we have heard and learned as part of our curriculums. And for that, we are always grateful to you, sir, and thank you so much for your valuable comments, inputs, and your presence throughout this lecture series. And I don't know why I'm speaking in English. Ma'am, if you don't mind, I'm just going back to Malayalam. Okay. അപ്പം നമ്മളുടെ ഒരു എനിക്കറിയാം പലരും ഭയങ്കരമായിട്ട് വിഷമിച്ചിരിക്കുകയാണ്, പക്ഷെ എന്നാലും കുറച്ച് കാര്യങ്ങൾ അക്നോളജ് ചെയ്യാതെ പോകാൻ പറ്റാത്തതുകൊണ്ട് വളരെ സ്പീഡിൽ പറയാണ്. നമുക്ക് 7 lectures ആണ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നത്. അതിൽ ആദ്യത്തേത് അജയ് കുമാർ സാറിൻ്റെതായിരുന്നു, രണ്ടാമത്തേത് ഡോക്ടർ കെ വി ശശി, മൂന്നാമത്തേത് ഒബിയസ്ലി നമ്മുടെ രവീന്ദ്ര മാഷിന്റെ ആയിരുന്നു, നാലാമത്തേത് ഋഷൽ പിന്റോ, അഞ്ചാമത്തേത് സുനിൽ പിള്ളയിടം, ആറാമത്തേത് ഡോക്ടർ ദീപ ശ്രീനിവാസ്, ആൻഡ് ഏഴാമത്തേത് ഫൊഹന മാമിന്റെ ആയിരുന്നു. ഈ 5 lecture സീരീസിലും നമ്മളെ ഒരുപാട് പേര് പല തരത്തിൽ ഹെൽപ്പ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അവരുടെ എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരെടുത്ത് അക്നോളജ് ചെയ്യണം എന്ന് എനിക്ക് ആഗ്രഹമുണ്ട്. ബട്ട് ആൾക്കാർ കേൾക്കാൻ അധികമില്ല. എന്നാലും ഞാൻ വിചാരിക്കുകയാണ് യൂട്യൂബിലൂടെ ആരെങ്കിലും കേൾക്കണമെങ്കിൽ ഈ ഭാഗം കൂടി കേൾക്കുമെന്ന്. സോ ടോജോ കട്ട് ചെയ്യരുത് ഈ ഭാഗം. സോ നമ്മളുടെ ഓരോ I have to acknowledge each and every one of our librarians who have involved themselves into this particular arrangement. Blaise Joni, Anita Shaji, Nivya Thomas, Susan, George, Drebin Jasmuth, and every other Lithuanians who have contributed a lot. ഒത്തിരി ആൾക്കാരുണ്ട്. ആൻഡ് ഓരോരുത്തരുടെയും കാര്യം പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അജയൻ മാഷിന്റെ പേര് സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തത് ബ്ലേസ് ആണ്. ആൻഡ് അത് and it was a very big success for us. And രണ്ടാമത്തേത് ഒബ്വിയസ്ലി ശ്രീജിത്ത് ആണ്, നമ്മളുടെ മറ്റൊരു ലെറ്ററിയൻ സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ശശിമാഷ വിളിച്ചത്. മൂന്നാമത്തെ lecture നമ്മളുടെ രവീന്ദ്രൻ മാഷിന്റേത്. Again, Anita was the one who has suggested the title and the top and the speaker, even though we wanted to bring him. Then നാലാമത്തേത് obviously റുഷൽ പിന്റോ സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തത്. ഐ മീൻ I wanted to bring her, but അവരുടെ നമ്പർ എനിക്ക് തന്നത് പിന്നെ സജി സാറാണ്, because I've lost her number. And he also talked to her, so we are grateful for that. Pinne അഞ്ചാമത്തെ lecture സുനിൽ മാഷിന്റേത്, he was quite willing to come without even asking him to deliver a lecture, because of his respect for Krishnan sir. So we are grateful to Sunil Mash also. Then Deepa Srinivasന്റെ പേര് സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തത് നമ്മുടെ ലെറ്ററിയൻസ് പോലെയല്ല, ദിവ്യ ചന്ദ്രശോഭ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന കാലിക്കറ്റ് യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിലെ അസിസ്റ്റന്റ് പ്രൊഫസർ ആയിട്ടുള്ള അവര് വൊക്കേഷണലി ഇങ്ങനെ മെൻഷൻ ചെയ്ത് പോയതാണ്. and she suggested her name, and she also graciously given her mail ID to me. Then Nivia was the one who actually got her number. സോ ഇവരെ എല്ലാവരും വിളിച്ചത് ഞാനാണെങ്കിലും കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേറ്റ് ചെയ്തത് ഞാനാണെങ്കിലും ഇങ്ങനെ പല വഴിയിലൂടെ പലരും ശ്രമിച്ചിട്ടാണ് നമുക്ക് ഈ പറയുന്ന എല്ലാവരെയും ഇവിടെ കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ സാധിച്ചത്. സോ അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും മീൻസ് നമ്മൾ ഒഫീഷ്യലി നന്ദി പറയേണ്ട കാര്യമില്ല, എന്നാൽ പോലും ലോട്ട്സ് ഓഫ് ലവ് ആൻഡ് അഫെക്ഷൻ ഫോർ ഓൾ ദോസ് ഹു ഹാവ് ഹെൽപ്ഡ്. ആൻഡ് ഇന്നത്തേതിന് പറയാതിരിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല, ഇന്നലെ വൈകിട്ട് വരെ ഐ ഡിഡ്ന്റ് നോ ഹൗ ടു കോണ്ടാക്ട് തോമസ് സാർ ബിക്കോസ് obviously I didn't know him personally, but it was Hariharan sir who actually encouraged me to ask Ramachandran sir. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഞാൻ രാമചന്ദ്രൻ സാറിനെ വിളിച്ചതും രാമചന്ദ്രൻ സാറിന്റെ കയ്യിൽ നിന്ന് തോമസ് സാറിന്റെ നമ്പർ വാങ്ങിയതും. സോ ഹ്യൂജ് താങ്ക്സ് ടു ഹരിഹരൻ സാർ. അദ്ദേഹം ഇവിടെ ഇല്ല എന്നാലും പറയാണ്, അദ്ദേഹത്തിന്റെ വലിയൊരു ഹെൽപ്പ് ഉണ്ട്. ദേവഗിരി കോളേജിലെ HOD നമ്മുടെ മറ്റൊരു ലെറ്റേറിയൻ സലൽ വർമ്മ സർ, ഹി ഓൾസോ ഹെൽപ്ഡ് finding the details of all the people who have worked with Krishnan sir. Pinne and many other people who may or may not have associated with School of Letters have helped us popularizing our posters and all other things. Ajit MS, one of the former librarians, he helped posting all these things and inviting people I didn't know. So ഒരുപാട് ആളുകളുടെ എഫേർട്ടാണിത്. And you know that ഒരു ഫംഗ്ഷൻ നടക്കണമെങ്കിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ചെറിയ ചെറിയ ഹെൽപ്പുകളാണെങ്കിലും we got it on time, and that's why we were able to accomplish this. And നമ്മൾ അപ്രോച്ച് ചെയ്ത എല്ലാവരും വളരെ പോസിറ്റീവായിട്ടാണ് നമ്മളോട് റെസ്പോണ്ട് ചെയ്തത്. Every scholar we met, they were always willing to come and speak, primarily because of Krishnan sir and School of Letters, not necessarily because of us. So the whole credit goes to Dr. Krishnan. And yesterday also, all the colleagues who have come for him, it's all because of him and their love for him. And Sharif Maship ഇതിനിടയ്ക്ക് കമ്മ്യൂണിക്കേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, കോഴിക്കോട് മഴയാണ്, electricity പോയിരിക്കുകയാണ്, so that's why he was not able to attend. I think Narayana Mash was also in the same state. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് വരാൻ പറ്റാത്തവർക്ക് അത് കാരണമാണ് അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റാതിരുന്നത്. Even then I hope that it was comparatively, it was really a success. And ഇതിനുശേഷം നമ്മൾ യൂട്യൂബിലെ ലൈവ് ഗ്രൂപ്പിൽ കയറി നോക്കിയാൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് അറിയാം, യൂട്യൂബ് ലൈവിന്റെ നെറ്റ്വർക്കിൽ കയറി നോക്കുക, അവിടെ നല്ല വ്യൂവർഷിപ്പ് ആണ് നമ്മുടെ ഓരോ ലെക്ചേഴ്സും കിട്ടുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് അക്കാഡമിക്കലി മറ്റെന്തിനേക്കാളും ഉപരി അക്കാഡമിക്കലി കൃഷ്ണൻ സാറിന് ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഗിഫ്റ്റ് ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഭാഗത്ത് നിന്ന് കൊടുക്കാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞു എന്നുള്ളതിൽ വി ആർ ഇറ്റേണലി ഗ്രേറ്റ്ഫുൾ. ഇത് അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞതിലും നമുക്ക് വന്ന ഓരോ സ്കോളേഴ്സിനും ഇനി നല്ല രീതിയിൽ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് കൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് ട്രീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞതിലും ഒക്കെ വി ആർ എക്സ്ട്രീംലി ഹാപ്പി ആൻഡ് പ്രൗഡ്. ആൻഡ് ഇത്രയും പേരുടെ പേരെങ്കിലും അക്നോളജ് ചെയ്തിട്ടില്ലെങ്കിൽ ഐ തിങ്ക് അതിനൊരു ജസ്റ്റിസ് ഉണ്ടാവില്ല. ആൻഡ് ഓൾസോ സ്കൂൾ ഓഫ് ലെറ്റേഴ്സിലെ അധ്യാപകര് എല്ലാവരും തന്നെ ഈ ഗ്രൂപ്പിൽ ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാംസിലൊക്കെ പല സമയത്തായിട്ട് കയറിയിരുന്നു. രാധാകൃഷ്ണൻ സർ, ഹാരി സർ വാസ് എ കോൺസ്റ്റന്റ് പ്രസന്റ്, and PPR was there most of the time. So was Saji sir and other scholars, a few of our scholars. Of obviously language difference വന്നപ്പം കുറച്ച് ആളുകളുടെ കുറവുണ്ടായി, പക്ഷെ that's fine. And we hope that even though this function is over, it kind of gave us a sense of confidence that we will be able to arrange maybe lectures or discussions on important matters, on contemporary issues, and we plan to continue that as an alumni group. Nothing official, but we want to continue the things that we are doing as contributing to the cultural space and the knowledge system, so to say. സോ അതിലും ഞങ്ങൾ എല്ലാവരുടെയും സഹകരണം എക്സ്പെക്ട് ചെയ്യാണ്. സോ ഇതിൽ സഹായിച്ച എല്ലാവർക്കും ഒരു ഗ്രേറ്റ് താങ്ക്സ്, ഒരുപാട് നന്ദി, ഒരുപാട് സ്നേഹം. ഒപ്പം നമ്മളെ ഹോസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്ത അനീറ്റ, നിവ്യ, ഗ്ലേസ്, സൂസൻ, ഇവർക്ക് ഒരു സ്പെഷ്യൽ താങ്ക്സ്. പിന്നെ നമ്മുടെ പോസ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയ ഒരു കുട്ടിയുണ്ട്, അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് ഒരുപാട് താങ്ക്സ്. നമ്മുടെ നെറ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന യൂട്യൂബ് ചാനലാണ് നമുക്ക് ഈ ലിങ്ക് ഉണ്ടാക്കി തന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ടോജോ ഒരുപാട് പ്രഭാഷണങ്ങൾ അതിൽ വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പം ടു ഹിം ഓൾസോ വി ആർ എക്സ്റ്റെൻഡിങ് അവർ സിൻസിയർ ഗ്രാറ്റിറ്റ്യൂഡ്. ഇനി ഞാൻ ആരുടെയെങ്കിലും പേര് വിട്ടുപോയിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ സദയം ക്ഷമിക്കുക, because of the time limit and also because people are slowly leaving. I'm forced to wind it up. Again, Farheena ma'am, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. To Krishnan sir, loads of love and affection to you, sir. Thank you so much. This is our last valedictory
Just let
session.
me say thank you as well, Vinny. You've been speaking a lot. I'd like to thank all of you and your friends for arranging this. You're worthy students of Krishnan. All the best to Krishnan, and thank you, all of you, for also including me in this initiative. I think surely you can go ahead with other programs, but thank you. You've been working very hard. Thank you once and all the best, Krishnan, and all the best to the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so shall we?
We sign off, right?
Yeah. We can
Thank
sign
you.
off. Everyone, good night. I know I took
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
some time, but I'm sorry. I hope others will listen to us in the YouTube channel.